All right, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully everyone had a couple days to relax, and we are almost done this week, but welcome back on this Thursday. How's everyone doing out there? Let me know if you have any questions, comments, concerns at this point, and we'll see if we can address those, and we'll get started here in just about 3 more minutes. Did anyone have any problems taking the test in the last couple of days here, or anything along those lines? Hot and humid in the Tampa area. Yeah, I agree with that. It is not as hot here in the Los Angeles area. It's probably about 80 degrees today, which isn't too bad, but it is a little bit humid. I have pretty much no tolerance for humidity or heat, considering. All right, a couple people need to take it. So Missy, welcome. Fingers crossed. Hopefully Missy doesn't have to evacuate because of the fires out there. She's one of our moderators. What we'll do, just like everything else, is today we're going to finish with the advanced systems. Then we're going to get into the federal aviation regulations. We'll talk about commercial specific FARs that we need to deal with. And then we'll also talk about the generic FARs that you need to know as well. And then at the end, we'll open it up for any questions. And from that point, we'll call it a night. So hopefully end in about 3 hours from now. Any other questions before we get going here? So for those of you on the East Coast, I hope you're staying safe, especially with all the weather, especially in Louisiana and those areas, just because of the hurricane and everything else that seems to be transpiring. It seems to be a really bad year for weather all around. So someone was asking what type of plane that was. I believe that kind of looks like a TBM. Would be my guess. I think it's a TBM. There's 3 planes that kind of look similar, which is the TBM. The Piper Meridian is kind of the same class, if you will, or that same kind of type. And then there's the PC-12, the Pilatus. But just from the side view, that looks like a TBM to me. But maybe someone knows more than I do. Hello from New Jersey. Welcome, everyone. Rain in North Virginia. Yeah, I wish it was a little bit rainy here. It'd be nice to get 4 seasons rather than just 1 season. So we'll start about 20 more seconds, everyone. On Thursdays, we usually get a nice drop in attendance because that is like the equivalent of Friday. But hopefully they'll all come back on Tuesday here. Baltimore, welcome from Minnesota. All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. Like I said, welcome back this Thursday. This is going to be lesson number 3 out of 5. So we are a little bit more than halfway done, which is great. Today, let's see what we're going to be discussing in particular. So we are going to basically finish up with the systems. The systems that we talked about in lesson 2 were basically what you would expect to hear in your private pilot setting, except we go into a little bit more depth. But now what we're going to do is we're going to get into a lot of the new systems that you may or may not be familiar with. And keep in mind, as a commercial pilot, if you have the 250 hours in the ticket, I mean, you could theoretically hop into a jet aircraft, especially if you obviously have a multi-engine commercial. For those of you that are looking to do this professionally, when you finish your commercial, I'd recommend going for the multi-commercial. There's no hourly requirement on that, so it's basically up to proficiency. Most students are around the 3 to 5 hours. Some take a little bit longer, but this would be the time to do it. If you have a single engine commercial license, you can still get jobs, but it is going to give you a little bit more marketability if you have the multi-engine commercial license, which, like I said, is probably one of the easiest add-ons that you can do. And you would do it after you're done with this one. But anyways, what we're going to be talking about today is going to be the constant speed prop systems, how they work, what are the benefits, pros and cons of the actual constant speed prop. We'll talk about pressurization. We'll talk about oxygen systems. So we'll talk about the 3 different types of delivery systems for oxygen. What is aviator breathing oxygen? Why is it special or different than just medical grade oxygen or welding oxygen, any of those? And then we'll also talk about the actual delivery methods in terms of, is it a cannula? Is it a full face mask? Is it a pressure on demand or diluter on demand? In addition to that, we'll be talking about icing systems. So we'll talk about the differences between anti-ice and de-ice. So one's prevention and one is what happens after the fact. And we'll talk about some systems that, a lot of us may or may not actually have probably been familiar with, right? Most of us are probably not familiar with booted, like the de-ice boots or thermal anti-icing systems. Most of the stuff on the GA aircraft is either going to be boots, which we'll talk about, which basically expand and contract, or what we call the weeping wing, which is an alcohol-based system or a TKS fluid. Same thing with the oxygen systems. Most of us are less familiar with that and pressurization, but it is important that you understand how each one of these works. Pretty much one of the keys that they're going to ask you on your commercial oral is they're going to have you describe each one of these systems. So constant speed, pressurization, oxygen systems, and the icing, de-icing systems as well. So those are all fair game. Whether it is equipped in your aircraft or not, for the purposes of the commercial oral, you still have to have the ability to describe each of those systems and how they effectively operate. Keep in mind, every manufacturer is going to be slightly different. So the stuff that we look at is pretty much the mainstream FAA material that's pulled from the PHAC and the other manuals that they give us. Once we get through that, we're going to go to the Federal Aviation Regulations. So we've got to look at a few different definitions, primarily dealing with category and class of aircraft. We'll talk about the roles and responsibilities of pilot in command, second in command. Then from there, we're going to go back to the Part 61. We'll look at your privileges and limitations as a commercial pilot with and without an instrument rating. We'll talk about that. In addition to that, we'll talk about some more specific things such as holding out, which is just a fancy way of saying advertising your services, which we cannot do as commercial pilots. In addition to that, we will then talk about specific regulations for commercial pilots. I think it's 91, 145, 46, and 47, which basically allows us to get a letter of authorization and fly, but in a very limited capacity. And we'll talk about the needs for, if you go above and beyond some of these things, you're going to need to get an official license, like a Part 121 or a Part 135. So we'll get into that. After that, we're going to get into the Part 91 stuff, which is all of our VFR flight rules. We're not going to talk about IFR flight rules. There's just a couple that we need to touch on just for things that we need to kind of remember. So aircraft right away. We also have to talk about minimum safe altitudes. We're going to talk about cruising altitudes, VFR and IFR. We'll also talk about VFR and IFR actual fuel requirements. So we'll kind of refresh on that. We'll talk about the aviation documents that are required to be on board, which is the acronym AERO. And then after that, we'll get into the aviated, which is going to be your inspections. We are not going to have enough time to finish the inoperative equipment, so I will roll that over to Tuesday's class. And then on Tuesday, what we're going to do is we're going to finish the inoperative equipment. We're going to get into aviation weather. And that'll take up the majority of the time. So a lot of the weather that is going to be different, we're going to talk about all the same weather theory and aviation weather services, METARs, TAFs, all that stuff. We'll get into more complicated METARs as well. But we're going to look at some new weather products out there that the FAA wants us to know about. And we're pretty much going to be talking about the jet stream, where do we find the jet stream, clear air turbulence, and those types of things moving forward. And then the Thursday after that, which is going to be basically our final class, we're going to wrap it up with the aircraft performance. And those are going to be specific performance tables and charts. In addition to that, we have to talk about some safety related things, aeronautical decision making, crew resource management, single resource SRM, which is basically the single pilot version of that, and a little bit about airport operations. And then the other thing I forgot to mention on Tuesday, so Tuesday of next week, inoperative equipment, we have to talk about airspace briefly. Remember, at this point, you should be very comfortable and confident with airspace, but we're just going to do a real quick refresh, probably about 20 or 30 minutes. Then we'll get into aviation weather theory and then the actual aviation weather services. So like I said, a lot of this stuff is going to be things that you should already know, or we'll just kind of dig it out of your memory. A couple things I do also want to mention before we continue. This is still getting a couple questions on this in terms of how to check your test questions and kind of go back through any missed test questions and see what's going on. So what you're going to do is you're going to go to your profile, and if you go to your profile, it will have a list of all of your courses available to you. I'll put an easy link on the left-hand side of the menu, or I'll have Travis do that whenever he has a chance. And all you're going to do is click on student profile. You can follow the link, and then it will show up just like this. So when you're looking at this document, this is for a private pilot class, but yours will just say the commercial class. Any quizzes that you've taken, it does store every single quiz you take, and it stores it indefinitely. The big thing is that it'll give you your score and the attempt time and date. And if you want the statistics behind it, you can go ahead and, as circled there, it's that little tiny statistics button. If you click on that, that will then open up the original test. It will give you the test question, the answers for the test, and the explanation if you got it wrong. So that way you can kind of review that information. What we're trying to do in the next 20 days or so is we're going to be able to take all of your missed test questions, and then you can actually take a quiz specifically on just the ones that you missed. And that way we can kind of have a little bit more functionality than just saying these are all of the test questions and we'll take them. So then the other thing we'll be able to do here in the near future is when you take the finals, every single time that you take a final, it will basically give you 60 new questions, or in this case, the commercial will be 100 new questions. So every single time you restart it, you should not get the same question set. So these are some things that we're working on in the background while the classes are going on. All right, for those of you that are new or want some more information about upcoming classes, whether you're a current pilot, such as a commercial pilot in this class, or you need a refresher, we do have the private pilot class, which is starting this coming Monday, September 21st. It's going to run for 4 weeks. It's 12 classes total, so it'll be every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. It will slightly overlap with this class, but this class ends next Thursday, so it will be a little bit of overlap. So keep that in mind, but it will be the same time, so 5 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. That is a free class, so we do record the lessons and upload them in the associated area. For those of you for the instrument rating or looking for a refresh, or maybe you're going to go for a CFII and want to get the latest information, I'd highly encourage you to sign up for the Instrument Pilot Ground School. About a week after the Private Pilot Ground School ends, we'll start the free Instrument Pilot Ground School with those dates. So October 26th through November 20th, it will end the week before Thanksgiving. You'll have plenty of time to basically relax during Turkey Day and everything else. Same schedule, 4 weeks, 12 classes. It will be Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And then we also have the CFI program as well. So there probably are some people here in this class. As mentioned, the CFI program is pretty much the only one that is a paid program. It's going to start on November 2nd, and the full program goes through December 31st based on our schedule. But at the same time, it will be an ongoing program, basically year-round. We will have a calendar out here shortly, and that calendar will basically show the 16 lessons, and those 16 lessons will replete on different days and times. So I know for November through December, we are currently looking for Tuesday, Thursdays, and Saturdays. And if you can't make a specific class, number one, it's recorded, but number two, more importantly, that class will then be repeated live in the near future, probably the following month. We don't teach on, obviously, Christmas Eve, Christmas, Thanksgiving, any of the holidays, the big holidays or New Year's. But that program does include about 96 hours of live instruction. And then what will end up happening is when you take the classes, this system that we're on right now is very much a one-way street. So I can deliver to you, but you can't really respond other than the chat that we have. The technology that we have is very interactive. It's the same thing that you see in that commercial image on the right-hand side, where basically what will end up happening is I will basically teach for about an hour and a half or 2 hours as a lecture. Then we will break into smaller groups of about 6 to 8 CFI candidates, and that will be moderated by a flight instructor such as myself or another colleague. And what will end up happening is we will then be able to teach each other in real time in those smaller groups that same material, because that's the purpose of basically getting your CFI lessons. And then from there, you'll get basically real-time feedback from other students, and then also the flight instructor, to see how you can kind of improve your teaching skills and styles. I know a lot of us, we all know, for example, what a METAR is, right? But the question is how do you teach that, or how do you translate that? And that's kind of what you're learning in these classes. 90% of what you do for a CFI, keep in mind, 90% of your check ride is the oral. They already know you can fly the airplane and everything else, so the airplane portion is actually fairly easy. Once we're done with all that, we're gonna basically pair you guys up, and we'll do an 8-hour mock oral with myself. So it will we'll basically keep it exactly as if you're gonna be practicing for the oral. And that basically gives you all of the custom lesson plans. I think it's 760 pages total, all the books, all of that stuff. But the nice thing about it is that you can finish it in your own time, on your own schedule. Should you finish it on the online version, you can go to your local flight school and actually finish the flight portion, or we are always happy to have you out here in California. You can come visit with me, and we can basically finish it in about a couple days rather than taking 30 days out of your schedule. So as mentioned, it is $997 per student, and we can break it into, I think they're actually breaking it into either 1 payment, 3 payment, or 6 payment. I will confirm that with Rebecca, but that's the last I've heard about that. So it is a really good program, and I do know that the price will increase here coming up fairly shortly. For the purposes of getting back to this class, though, this class is available to you. All of the materials, all the tests, all the quizzes, all of the video replays are available until the 28th of this month at 12 noon. At that point, we basically shut down the course. And as mentioned a million times, is that the only reason we do that is it allows for higher completion rate, kind of hold your feet to the fire, make sure that we can do this as a group collectively. My goal is to get everybody that's here in this class and is actively participating through this program. I want to see you guys out there flying professionally, or even just to do this to improve your own skills. So keep in mind that even if you have no desire to fly commercially, your commercial license will reduce your insurance rates. In addition to that, it will really make you a safer and more proficient pilot. For those, David was asking, what was the examiner in Camarillo? The one that I use is, I've used them all. There's Joe Justice retired. There's Lewis, I don't really recommend. Dennis Magdaleno is the one that I like, though. So you have that. For those of you that are looking for a little bit longer term commitment, or you need additional time for it, we do have the lifetime access, which is still available. The lifetime access basically provides access for life for this course. There is no time requirement if you need to finish this class. So you could basically get your wings credits or take the request the FAA test endorsement at any point in time. In addition to that, we kind of packaged it together, so you will get the private pilot ground school and the oral prep course. And in addition to that, you'll get the instrument ground school as well. So most of the time, if you look at our competitors and those types, usually that $144 is per class is what you're looking at. So you're getting a pretty good deal. For those of you that are interested in the commercial ground school for the Part 107, if you have any desire to be a drone pilot, you can take that. The 4-flight class is also on there, and we're actually going to be refilming that in December. You get the PDF guide of how to become a pilot. So we're all probably at that stage, but if you need something for your nephew or family members or anybody that's asking questions about it, it's like a 120-page guide that I wrote on everything that I wish I knew going into my initial days as a student pilot, flight training. What do I do? What do I not do? It does also provide the 24/7 instructor support. You'll also get the written test endorsements, and what's hidden behind my little image there is that basically the first 50 people will receive a 1-hour one-on-one ground instruction lesson with an instructor. And I think we still have a couple more of those available. I'll leave it up throughout the rest of the course here. And like I said, this offer will be available until the last day of class. And that doesn't expire. You can use it at any point in time. Doesn't have to be for the commercial. If you want to use it for something else or for the purposes of, let's say, a flight review, that will count for the hour for your flight review as well. So, all right. So as my public service announcement, I appreciate everyone sticking on board with that. And like I said, if you have any questions, we can go ahead and cover those as we go along or at the end of class. What we're going to be doing today is we are going to be finishing the aircraft systems, and this is kind of the meat of it, like I said. Let me readjust the slide, make sure this thing actually fits on the screen appropriately. All right, there we go. So with advanced aircraft systems, whether your aircraft is capable of what we're going to be discussing or not, as a commercial pilot, you are responsible for at least understanding the basics of the system. So these are the things, as I said in the beginning, that we'll be talking about. So first thing that we're going to be discussing is going to be the constant speed prop versus the pitched propeller. So we talked about this a little bit at the very end of class, so just want to do a quick refresher for those that may have signed off a little bit early. So most of us are probably have flown at least a fixed pitch prop, and the fixed pitch prop is just that. It is basically forged either in steel or aluminum, and what ends up happening is however it's designed, that blade angle cannot be changed at any point in time. And the designers basically have to figure out, there's a cruise prop and then there is a climb prop. And what they do is they basically compromise, and what they usually will do is they'll kind of blend the two together, and it allows really for the best angle of attack for climb and the best angle for cruise. Now, this is always going to be set in stone, as we know, and the power is always equal to our RPM. So that black lever that we're used to, if we push that in, that's going to increase our RPMs, and obviously if we pull it out, that's going to decrease it. Remember that power lever, if we're talking about it in kind of association to the carburetor, remember that is what's controlling that butterfly valve in that circumstance, okay? The constant speed prop, though, on the other hand, is a separate control for power and RPM, and it's usually a blue knob. It's standardized to be blue, but there are some aircraft out there that have it as a white knob. And anytime we move that prop control, it's going to change the angle of attack, or that prop pitch. It'll basically take a bigger bite of air if necessary. And the nice thing about it is it really allows for a more efficient flight, right? So in a climb, we can have a specific, more efficient setting that will allow us to climb at a greater rate. And then the en route portion, and also the descent portion as well. So what we need to talk about here is, how is that controlled? How is it designed? And then how does it actually work at the end of the day? Most of us, when we're in the run-up area, we usually hear this. We usually hear that wailing sound of a prop kind of, it's kind of making that feathering noise, if you want to call it that. So we're kind of used to at least seeing it. Now, the basics of the way it works is anytime that we do this, we're obviously going to have an extra gauge. And that extra gauge beyond the RPM is called the manifold pressure gauge. And the manifold pressure gauge is really what tells us the potential power that's going to the engine. That tachometer in this circumstance actually tells us how much power is being used. And anytime that we fly, there's usually a good rule of thumb here that most of the time, if you've never been in an airplane, there's two things that I'll tell you. Number one, always keep the prop lever forward or equal to the throttle. It should never be behind it. That's just a rule of thumb. And in addition to that, usually what we do is we fly in what we call square. So for example, in the diamonds that we fly quite a bit, what we usually say is that they want you to be 25 squared. All that is a fancy way of saying 2,500 RPM and 25 inches of manifold pressure, okay? Now, one thing you'll notice with the manifold pressure, if you were to look at it without the engine actually running, it actually just shows you the actual ambient pressure out there. So if you listen to ATIS or got the information from any weather services out there and it says that the pressure is 30.12, if you glance over at your manifold pressure, it will say roughly 30 inches on it, which is kind of cool as well. Now, anytime that we are taking off, climbing, or landing, this is kind of the position that we want to be in. So this is what we consider full forward. And that blue lever, when it's full forward, is considered to be low pitch, high RPM. Low pitch, high RPM. Now, anytime that we increase the power, there's always an order of the way we do it. And remember that I said we always keep the prop control more forward or equal to the throttle. So that's the reason why we do it in this order. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to richen the mixture if necessary or as necessary. Then what we do is we move the prop control forward. And then after that, we would increase the manifold pressure using, and that's basically our throttle, our black knob. It'll be the reverse of that when we move to a slower amount. And usually when we're taking off or landing, as mentioned, we want the prop full forward. It's going to give us, as stated, pretty much the best climb. And the reason why we also want it in the full forward position while coming into land is going to be in case we need to do a go around. Now, looking at it in the opposite way, if we have it all the way to the back, it's going to be a high pitch, low RPM, and we generally are going to use this in the cruise setting. And most of the time out there, it will be somewhere in the middle. We never really bring it that far back. I've never seen it that far back. When we want to reduce power, so let's say that we take off and we're climbing at 25 squared, and we want to slowly start reducing power, the first thing that we're going to do is we are then going to bring the throttle back as necessary. So we'll set that. The throttle is going to set our manifold pressure. And then from there, we'll adjust the prop accordingly. So that will adjust our RPMs. Now, that will then take a high pitch, low RPM. And what will end up happening, though, is that you can use the general numbers of 24 squared or 25 squared. That generally works for most airplanes until you get to 1,000 feet. And then the book will tell you what to do from there. For the cruise settings, it becomes a little bit more complicated. And you always want to make sure you have the correct cruise settings. So this is the reason why you want a copy of your POH available to you in flight. Based upon whatever the pressure altitude or the altitude that you're going to be flying at, it will give you a variety of manifold and RPM settings for the most efficient flight characteristics, or however you want to think about it that way. Now, the way that all of these work is what changes the blade angle is just oil pressure. So if we were to look inside of the actual device itself, you're going to see these flyweights, and these are the flyweights right here. There is a governor and there's a flyweight. And basically what ends up happening is that this system is going to do its best to hold on to a very specific RPM. So if you set 2,300 RPM, it will do whatever it can to hold 2,300 RPM to the best of its ability. So what I want to do is I'm going to show you on this website that I like kind of what that looks like, because it's a little bit easier with the motion. So let me go ahead and bring this up real quick here. But if you've ever looked at a constant speed prop, you'll notice that the actual prop itself, not the prop itself, but the nose of the prop, or the spinner, kind of that little hubcap, if you want to think about it that way, it is usually bigger. And the reason why it's bigger is it has, I can spell constant, it does have a cylinder in there, and that cylinder is basically under pressure. And what will end up happening is, depending on if the system is pressurized or not, it will then change the blade angle. So give me just 1 second. Let me go ahead and share my screen here so that way you guys can see this. For those of you that are unfamiliar with Bold Method, I would encourage you to check them out. They are a great organization. It's a group of guys that went to University of North Dakota, so they're all flyers. The two who actually own and run the website were, I think, in air traffic control. I think they did the air traffic control program and then the professional aviation program. But if you guys are interested, they have great articles and great information on a variety of different topics. It's just boldmethod.com is the actual name of the website. And I think they did very, very well writing different code and things for the oil and gas industry. So they're able to kind of do this on the side. But anyways, they have kind of a really nice setup. And I'll show you guys the link as well, because it's very easy to kind of understand. Anyways, if we were to look at this, and I'll blow it up so we can all see here. We don't need to look at the ads on the side. So if you were to look at this, this is what it would be in the takeoff configuration. So in this case, what we have is the prop control is full forward. It is a low pitch, high RPM prop blade setting, okay? Now, if you look at the actual spinner, as I said before, the spinners are usually going to be a little bit larger. And the reason why they're larger, it does have a cylinder in there, and it looks like kind of a piston. And that piston is pressurized by the oil system. So what you have is a series of flyweights, and here is the flyweight in blue. And then there's a governor, all right? So the governor is basically trying to manage this very specific speed. And depending if it overspeeds or underspeeds, you'll have a different result. So if it overspeeds, we're going to see that these flyweights are basically going to come outwards. And if it underspeeds, they'll start to come in. This is what it looks like in the other version here, where let's say we're doing a descent, or maybe we're in cruise. Probably going to be in the cruise configuration. So we have the prop pulled back. Remember, we're not going to go all the way back, but it might be 25 to 50% back. This is going to give us a high pitch, low RPM. You'll notice that there's really no change in the flyweights or anything else here. This is just showing you the configuration of the actual prop blade itself. And you can see that it is a little bit more angled than what we were looking at before. All right, so this is the reason why I like this is they do these cool animations here. Let me go down just a little bit. So this is what's actually happening. So when we are pressurizing the system, the oil is represented by that kind of a golden color, if you will. And basically, when we start pressurizing the system, it is pushing on that piston, if you will, and that piston is then connected to the prop, and that's changing the blade angle either to a bigger bite or a littler or smaller bite. All right. So that's basically what's happening in a nutshell. But let's see what's actually going on behind the scenes. So there is a component here called a governor, and the governor is always trying to basically make everything equal depending on how we set the system up. So if we set the system up and we say, Mr. Governor, I want you to hold on to 2,200 RPMs, it's going to do its darndest to go ahead and do that. Now, as we see here, the oil system is generally going to be a little bit larger because it has a little bit more spaces to go to rather than just the standard engine. Now it's actually going to the spinner itself. And one of the things that we actually do during our run up is we really want to cycle this system, meaning we're actually going to pull the prop lever all the way back and forward about 2 to 3 times. And we are effectively just trying to get the oil to move throughout the system to make sure we have fresh oil in the spinner before we take off and make sure that there's no system errors or anything along those lines. So as we look at it, we have a governor control, and then we have our flyweights, which we'll keep talking about. So in the neutral position here, our flyweights are perfectly vertical. And I'll show you how they actually work in the animation coming up. And then we have the actual engine oil pressure. So at the very, very bottom here is the engine oil pressure. And what will end up happening is as these flyweights expand outward, and what that would look like is if they expanded outward, they're actually going to kind of come down and then at an angle, and it would look something like that. What will end up happening is that when they are outward, it will pull this entire plunger up. And as it pulls up, that will allow that oil to basically go in and basically affect the change of angle, if you will, or the actual position of the prop. All right, we'll see these in detail as we kind of go along here. All right, let's go ahead and continue down. All right, so this is what is officially happening. I'll make it a little bit, see if I can get something there. All right, so this is the reason why I like this, this kind of description, is they do a really good job. So starting at the very, very beginning, we pull the lever back and the prop is going to take a bigger bite of air. Okay, so as the engine RPMs are going to decrease, what will end up happening is that, remember, the governor is trying to catch up. So these flyweights will fly out because there's less spring tension. It will lift up that valve. You'll have the oil, which is going into the actual spinner, and it will push the cylinder, which means that it will change the blade angle. As the RPMs are decreasing and they're getting to whatever we set it to, the fly weights will then basically go to that vertical position, if you will, and then it will basically hold that oil pressure, and it kind of locks the oil from going in or out of the actual prop hub in that circumstance. As you can imagine, the next one that we're going to look at is the same thing, except for the fact that the fly weights are actually going to be a little bit closer in. And what that will allow is this whole system will actually go, down. And when it goes down, the oil will then go out of the system and go back to the primary sump there. All right. So go ahead and look at that real quick here. And for those of you on a check ride, I've always encouraged students, if you're not a good drawer and you're trying to basically draw a system, you can, if you have access to the internet or anything like that, you are more than welcome to use something like this to basically describe the system to the examiner. If the examiner does not allow you to maybe use bold method, they want you to use an FAA resource. There are obviously the images inside the PHAC, so you can utilize that. All right, let's go ahead and look at it. And what happens if we take a smaller bite of the air? So if we push the lever forward, the prop takes a smaller bite. All right, so the governor is now having this issue where we are basically trying to do an increase. Okay, so as the engine RPM increases, we have the fly weights. We have the fly weights, which are basically going to come inwards, just like that. You can see as it falls, we have the plunger, which pushes down. As it pushes down, that oil pressure that's basically kept in the prop hub is naturally going to want to escape and go back to the actual oil sump itself. All right. So looking at it again, pushing the prop lever forward turns the screw right, which increases the tension. Fly weights fall in because of increased speeder spring tension, lowering the valve. The engine oil escapes the hub and spring forces piston forward. Okay. So you can see, and like I said, I will share this website with you, this direct link, or if you guys want to look at it on your own, literally just type in constant speed prop. It's the very, very first thing that comes up. Everybody kind of uses this as instructors because they did such a good job. So the other thing we're also going to talk about is an underspeed and an overspeed. So anytime that we are in an underspeed condition, obviously an overspeed means that if I set the RPMs to 2300 and the system starts to go to, let's say, 2350 or 2400, that is considered an overspeed. An underspeed is just the opposite. If I set the system to 2200 and it's only at 2100, what will end up happening is that the fly weights will basically come in, and this is how the system is basically compensating in order to try to attain or get to that RPM that we set in the system. The overspeed is just the opposite, as mentioned. So the fly weights will basically go out, and that will allow the oil pressure to go in and change the blade angle. All right. If you lose your engine, it always goes to what we call the fail forward position, which is the low pitch, high RPM setting, which is the best position for us. All right. So with that, let's go back to the slideshow. As you can see here, though, I prefer that site than to something as boring as this because it does a little bit better job explaining what is actually happening here. So looking at this system, this is an FAA image. You could explain it. Obviously, if you have the ability to use a website like Bold Method, I would recommend it. All right, before we start the polls, just as a quick reminder for those of you that are joining us or don't remember how to do it, at the very bottom of your screen, you're going to have three different things. It'll say offer, file, and poll. Poll will be the center one when it becomes available. And make sure that you please answer the question in the poll. If not, what will end up happening is you'll get yelled at by about 50 people here. All right, let's go ahead and give it a shot here. So very first question we're going to talk about is going to be dealing with the controllable pitch prop. So let me go ahead and bring up the poll question. I'll give everyone a moment here. So for takeoff, the blade angle of a controllable pitch propeller should be set at, is it A, a small angle of attack and high RPM, B, a large angle of attack and low RPM, or C, large angle of attack and high RPM. For those of you that are interested in flying one of the constant speed props or controllable pitch props, usually this is going to be for a little bit more advanced aircraft. You can get into some of this stuff, with like the Diamonds and some of the other aircraft out there. So if you guys do this, you're usually going to be going over the same information with a flight instructor in order to get that sign off. Remember the endorsement that we need. Does anyone remember? There's a specific endorsement that we need for a certain type of aircraft out there. Try to answer not in the chat. Try to answer in the poll if you can, please. So remember, it is a constant speed prop, and anytime that we have a constant speed prop, that's probably gonna fall in line with a complex aircraft. It may not always 100% be that case, but remember, a complex aircraft is one that has an adjustable speed prop or a constant speed prop, if you want to call it that. In addition to that, has a retractable gear and flaps. Needs to have all three. Good job, Colleen. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end it right there. I got about 70% of the class with the correct answer here, which is going to be A. So great job, everyone, for following along with that. All right, let's go ahead and move on. Next thing we're gonna talk about is the fuel injected engine. So we spent about 20 or 30 minutes yesterday effectively talking about how a carbureted engine works. And hopefully now you guys understand the different components, especially you can see when people understand the carbureted engine or instructors understand it, especially if they understand the whole principles where we have that accelerator pump. A lot of people are just pumping the throttle slowly back and forth to prime it, and that's really not doing anything. If you give it a solid pump fairly rapidly, that's what kind of will allow the accelerator pump to become effective and basically give it a shot of fuel. Now, the fuel injected engine is better, and it has its advantages and disadvantages. It's really a much better system overall. I'd say the biggest disadvantage at the end of the day, which we'll look at, is obviously if you lose an engine, it's a little harder to start than a carbureted engine. And the biggest differences that you have here are we have the fuel tank, doesn't matter high wing or low wing. We are going to have an engine-driven fuel pump, and then we have an auxiliary fuel pump. Usually the auxiliary fuel pump is going to be used in starting the engine, which allows us to prime it, pressurizes the fuel system. Some manufacturers will tell you to use the auxiliary fuel pump on takeoff and landing for the purposes of if you lost your engine-driven fuel pump, that's obviously a critical phase of flight. So that's kind of your redundancy. Just keep in mind, some do and some don't. The biggest difference here is, remember, we said the carburetor is kind of your ultimate mix master, if you will. It's kind of creating that perfect blend of fuel-air mixture before it sends it to the engine. The difference that we have here is considered the fuel-air control unit, which would be similar to the actual carburetor. But in this case, it does a much, much better job. The biggest difference is that with the carbureted engines, we are after it goes through the throat of the venturi, and that fuel air mixture is then sent to the cylinders. The biggest difference, though, is that this does a much better job of sending equal amounts of fuel air mixture to each of the cylinders. That is kind of the best thing about this. Once it leaves the fuel air control unit, it's going to go to what we call the FMV, or the fuel manifold valve, which is like a spider-like device, which then sends it into each one of the cylinders, and it does it fairly well. So let's look at the advantages first, and then we'll look at the disadvantages. So as I mentioned before, it does have a better or improved control of the fuel-air ratio, which does allow for a more uniform delivery of the fuel-air mixture to each cylinder. It does increase our engine efficiency because of that, which is always good. And what's also really nice that we all love about it is that it is less susceptible to the vaporization ice or fuel ice. it's one less lever that we have to deal with in terms of applying carb heat. So anytime we're in a fuel-injected airplane, you'll notice that the carb heat lever is absent because we don't need that anymore. The other thing as well is it provides instant acceleration of the engine without any hesitation. Remember that what's allowing that instant acceleration in the carburetor is that accelerator pump. So if you are aggressively adding throttle on a carburetor, it will basically push on that little plunger that gives it an extra squirt of gas. Disadvantages of the fuel injected system are any type of contamination, doesn't matter what it is, dirt, water, sand, anything along those lines. It will have a greater impact on the system overall, but we're always trying to sump and check our fuel quality and prior to even departure. This is another one, vapor lock. So you may have difficulty starting the engine on any hot days. This was a big problem in the Diamonds, whether it was a hot day or not. I know the Diamond DA40 that I flew, this thing was just notorious. If we were picking up a student and I and another instructor just came out of that aircraft and it was still warm, it was still a it was a challenge to go ahead and start that thing. I remember flying up to Paso Robles with a student a couple years ago, and the guy had to really use the restroom, and of course I told him we're probably not gonna be able to restart this thing, but when you gotta go, you gotta go. And sure enough, we had to wait 20-30 minutes for the engine just to cool down before we were able to start it. So that's one of the big things to kind of watch out for. Other thing as well is the surplus fuel could be routed to one tank, and it usually causes fuel imbalances. So that's another thing we always watch out for as well. But you can get a fuel imbalance in a carbureted if you're not paying attention, especially the low wings. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is going to be our turbocharging systems. And the turbocharging systems is a pretty basic and easy system. The only difference here is going to be the turbocharging systems are basically predicated or based off of the fuel injected systems. And the biggest thing that you're going to notice that's the difference is this little turbine wheel in the back here. Actually, it's the entire system. There's this whole thing right here. All right. So what we do is we use the exhaust air. So the exhaust from the engine is basically routed. Normally, what ends up happening is that exhaust air is just basically routed, over basically out of the aircraft, and then we don't use it for anything. In this case, what we're doing is it is routed, and it basically allows us to spin this device. And that is then in turn connected to the compressor. And that is the little compressor there. And the compressor is then going to compress the air and send the compressed air to the cylinders. The compressor basically does two things. Number one, it compresses the air. So it's going to think or trick the airplane into thinking that the engine is at a lower altitude or near sea level, if you want to think about it that way. And then in addition to that, it's also going to heat up the air just ever so slightly. So what that allows you to do is kind of by tricking the airplane, if you think about it that way, is it's kind of pressurizing that air. Remember that the partial pressure at flight levels or even at 10 or 15,000 feet is far less than it will be at sea level. So the aircraft is basically going to think or act or perform as if it's at a lower altitude than it is, and it also allows it to fly higher. Now, the turbocharger for most of these aircraft are going to be in usually they can be in turbine aircraft or turboprop aircraft. In addition to that, there are some pistons out there, but they're going to be on the more expensive side. So typically, if we look at a performance chart on a turbocharged aircraft, what will end up happening is that you might be at flight level 250, but the aircraft is going to perform as if it's at 12,000 feet. So it does allow it to fly higher, which also leads into some other issues as well, which we're going to talk about, which is going to be pressurization. In addition to that, the different types of oxygen systems that are involved. So remember, you will have to describe this to an examiner. But as I mentioned before, it's pretty easy. You have the turbocharger itself, which is in that red box there. What ends up happening is when you start the engine, you have all of your exhaust gases leaving. And when the turbocharger is not needed, because it's not needed at all times, it will then just go out the wastegate, and the wastegate opens, and that'll just basically dump the exhaust overboard. Other than that, what will end up happening is that the exhaust will then start to spin this device here, which is then connected by a rod to the actual compressor. That air intake is then compressed, and as that compressed air goes in, and remember, it's going to go through an air filter as well, then it will be the compressed air going into the engine cylinders, which will give you a better, a lot better performance, and will allow you to fly much, much higher and than what you'd normally be able to do. All right, moving on to aircraft pressurization. So this is a pretty standard pressurization chart, but there's a couple different terminologies or terms that we need to know prior to kind of getting into how the system works. It's very easy to kind of understand the very, very basics of pressurization. You can kind of think of like a Coke bottle or something like that, where we have a pressure vessel. The pressure vessel itself is just that. It is basically going to be your cockpit or cabin. And if you were to kind of walk around a pressurized aircraft, you'll kind of see a bowing or a bending. And especially in the airlines, if you kind of stick your head in between the landing gear and the wheel wells, you kind of clearly see that pressure vessel because it looks exactly kind of round in shape. All right. That pressure vessel is effectively where we're trying to increase the pressure and store the pressure. But what ends up happening is we have the aircraft altitude, which is obviously whatever the height is above sea level. We're going to talk about the ambient temperature, which is the temperature in the area immediately surrounding the aircraft. We have the ambient pressure, which is the pressure in the area surrounding the aircraft. We have a cabin altitude, which is our cabin pressure in terms of the equivalent altitude above sea level. And then we have the differential pressure. So that's the difference of the actual pressure inside the cabin and the ambient pressure outside the cabin as well. So basically the surrounding the aircraft. So this is most likely going to be on a turbocharged aircraft, but what ends up happening is part of the turbocharger compressor section, which is going to be represented right there. I'll circle it for you. Is remember the compressor, the natural, things that kind of happen when you compress air is beyond just being compressed and pressurized, it actually heats the air up. So the very, very first thing that it does is it goes through what we call a heat shroud. And that heat shroud is basically mixing it with cooler air or allowing it to kind of cool down. Once it is cooled down to a specific level, that air is basically going to be considered conditioned. That's what we mean. Just like when we say air conditioner, that means that it's conditioned at the appropriate temperature. And then from there, all it is we have the pressure vessel. So in this case, in this example, the pressure vessel is the cockpit itself, kind of drawn in the square there. The green vents allow that pressurized conditioned air to enter the aircraft. So we have vents in the front and vents in the back. So this is basically allowing that pressurized air to enter the pressure vessel. Now, at the very front of the cockpit, I'll show you what it looks like, but we're going to have a controller, or what we call a cabin pressure controller. And that is for most of the general aviation aircraft and some of the older aircraft out there, what we have to do is we have to manually set the cabin pressure controller based upon the altitude. And you have to be very, very careful because you want to control your ascents and descents at a specific rate. I know on the Embraer that I flew, it was all done by the computer. Unless the computer broke, then there was a manual way that we could do it. And the book would basically tell us at this altitude, you need to be at this PSI. Now, this system is basically going to continuously pressurize the aircraft. And the cabin pressure controller is effectively doing one thing, which is controlling this outflow valve here. The outflow valve will either open or close, and if it's closed, then it will basically allow more and more pressure to stay within that pressure vessel or the actual cabin of the aircraft. And obviously, if we want less pressure, then it will open the outflow valve and it will release some of the pressure. Kind of like if we shake, one of these plastic Coke, Coke cans or whatever they're called, Coke bottles, and we slowly let out some of the pressure, and then we close it so it doesn't basically explode on us. The other thing that all of these systems will have is going to be a safety or emergency dump valve, which is right here. The dump valves are going to be set by the manufacturer to a specific PSI. So what will end up happening is that should the outflow valve, this one right here, break and the cabin controller is basically not opening or closing that outflow valve, we don't want to get into a situation where it keeps pressurizing the aircraft and basically keeps adding more and more and more pressure to the point where it could potentially explode or cause a failure. The whole system's not going to explode, but it could potentially blow out a window or a gasket or something along those lines if it continues. So the safety valve or the emergency dump valve, that's not really something that we control. That is set by the manufacturer. So when it hits a given PSI, then it will open automatically and relieve the pressure. And that's basically a safety related thing that we're looking at. Okay. The way that we control all this, as mentioned, is known as the cabin pressure controller. Usually what you'll have is two different instruments in addition to your normal cockpit instruments. So on the left-hand side, we have what we consider a cabin rate of climb indicator. So it works just like our vertical speed indicator, except it's just measuring the rate of climb inside of the cabin itself. It's not measuring the actual rate of climb, based upon the aircraft, all right? The other one on the right-hand side is the cabin differential pressure indicator. So as you can see here, the cabin differential pressure indicator is all going to be pounds per square inch differential is what we call them. And the other one that we have is the cabin pressure altitude indicator, which is going to be in thousands of feet. And then we have a maximum cabin differential pressure limit, which is basically this area in red here. Now, before it hits the maximum cabin differential pressure limit, that is usually where the manufacturers are going to set that safety or dump valve to basically go off. There's usually a point of usually like 0.5 psi or something along those lines before it actually is going to get into that red level. So the system, that's kind of that emergency relief valve that we were talking about. As mentioned before, on the right-hand side, you have the atmospheric chart, and this is basically showing you the altitude and the PSI at the various altitudes. So our goal in flight is, if we're at 14, 15, 16,000 feet, you can see even at 18,000 feet, our PSI is 7.3. But we can, depending on the system will then allow us to basically create an artificial environment and keep it maybe at 8,000 feet. Most of the aircraft out there nowadays, especially the new ones, have the capability of basically creating an environment for passengers to maintain either a 6,000 or 8,000 foot cabin throughout the flight. And that really allows us to fly for longer periods of time. Most of the aircraft, though, are around the 8,000 foot limit. I know some of the Dreamliners out there have the capability of 6,000 feet. So every airplane, though, at the end of the day is going to be slightly different, but this is just the generic version of it. So when we use these different instruments, these are just the separate specific instruments that we use for the purposes of pressurization, but we still have to manage flying the airplane and everything else. Remember that the cabin differential pressure gauge is basically indicating the difference between the inside and the outside pressure. And this is the gauge that you really want to monitor to ensure that it does not exceed the maximum allowable differential pressure. And once again, every aircraft is different in that regard. The cabin altimeter is also provided as a check on the performance of the system. And in some cases, the two instruments are combined into one. And then there's the third instrument, which indicates the cabin rate of climb or descent. Now, once we start talking about this here, we're then going to get into what we call types of decompression. Let me just see if there's any questions in there. Ricardo said the Dreamliner can go to 4,000. That's pretty awesome. Why would we ever be above 15,000 feet? Daniel's asking that. So keep in mind, the higher that we fly, airliners, the reason why airliners fly at 30 or 40,000 feet is going to be because of efficiency, right? Number one, airlines are in the business of making profit, and the higher that we fly, the more efficient that we can basically be, meaning that we're going to burn less gas. And whether that's a turbine aircraft or a jet-powered aircraft, we will be more efficient in terms of our fuel burn. In addition to that, remember that our true airspeed increases about 2% for every 1,000 feet. So when we are cruising at 34,000 feet, we might have an indicated airspeed of, let's say, 280 knots, but we might have a true airspeed of somewhere around, 460, 470 knots. And if you maybe add a tailwind to that, you can maybe hit 500 knots. So, if you imagine the airliners all flying at 15,000 feet, we wouldn't get very far. We'd burn a ton of gas and it just wouldn't be effective. Let's see here. The other one that I read from someone basically said, well, where does the oxygen kind of fit into this? So remember that the oxygen, percentage of oxygen, which is roughly about, was it 18 or 21%? I don't remember off the top of my head. Someone will correct me on that. Is the same. It doesn't matter if you're at sea level or if you're at 8,000 feet. It's the pressure. It's the partial pressure. So when we take a breath at sea level, as you can see here, we have a higher atmospheric pressure of 14.7 inches. So when we go up in the atmosphere, because that pressure is decreased, we are not, we're basically not as effective, and it doesn't mean the oxygen level is any less. Okay. So let's go ahead and talk about the different types of decompression. We all probably seen a picture like this. This is Aloha Airlines Flight 243. I believe it's from the 80s. Now, this is obviously an explosive decompression. There's two different types of decompression. And the first one, there's really not much of a difference between explosive and rapid. But the definition of a decompression is really just the inability of the aircraft's system to maintain its designated pressure differential. The ones that we really, if we had a choice, the ones that we really don't want to deal with are explosive and rapid. And then there's also kind of a slow, insidious decompression. What would end up happening is in this flight specifically, this went through way too many cycles. And a cycle is defined in the industry as a takeoff and a landing. So when we take off and land, we're basically pressurizing that aircraft and then depressurizing it. So that's considered one cycle. Some aircraft, I know like the Embraer Air, if we go above 36,000 feet, because the pressure is increased, we actually consider that two cycles on the airframe. But at the time, the airline industry and the manufacturers didn't know that there was really limits in terms of how many cycles or pressurization and depressurization events could happen. And what ended up happening is it was basically a combination of metal fatigue and a bunch of other things. And this thing had a ton of flight hours and a ton of what we consider the cycles at the time. And effectively, this is the result, during a flight, and this would be considered, explosive decompression, where I believe a flight attendant was sucked out, and I think a couple passengers as well. So pilot was able to land and get the remaining passengers safely off. But as you can see, they're very lucky for what it is. Luckily, that aircraft has a lot of the flight controls running underneath the floor and not in the ceilings for that. So the explosive decompression is a change in cabin pressure faster than the lungs can decompress, and it will generally result in lung damage, okay? That is what is considered explosive decompression. Rapid decompression is a change in cabin pressure in which the lungs decompress faster than the cabin, But you'll notice that really the only difference here in the terminology that we use by the FAA is kind of that statement here of possibly resulting in lung damage. So explosive is going to be possibly resulting in lung damage, and the rapid is just it's going to be pressure in which the lungs decompress faster than the cabin. So all of these events are going to be very serious, such as the one like Aloha Airlines flight. This could be due to a number of different factors. This could also be due to, let's say, a window that's blown out, or anything that's basically going to be fairly instantaneous. Rapid and explosive is going to jostle you to the point where you're going to know what's going on fairly rapidly. A slow decompression is another one as well. So a slow decompression is one in which the cabin basically starts to decompress, but at a very slow rate, and it's not going to be very noticeable. This could be due to let's say, for example, the pressurization system has failed, and you're flying along, and what ends up happening is slowly the aircraft, the cabin altitude starts to rise. So you set it for 8,000 feet. And slowly it starts going to 9,000, 10,000, 11,000, 12,000 feet. So that's a very slow one. It's also common in the doors as well. If you have a bad door seal, that could be considered a slow decompression. And these are things that you want to watch out for as well. So this is the reason why we look at that cabin pressure controller. In the airlines, there's usually alarms and bells and sorts of things like that. In the Embraer, if the cabin pressure basically went to a specific level, we would get an alert that basically said high cabin altitude. And if it continued, I believe it was beyond 14,000 feet, the mask would actually deploy automatically. All right, let's go ahead and continue here and look at just kind of a refresh here of the different oxygen requirements for the unpressurized aircraft. And this is basically for all aircraft. So remember, 91-211 is the supplemental oxygen. So with this, we should all know these numbers, but we're also going to take these numbers and start talking about pressurized aircraft as well. We will take a break, everyone, in 5 more slides, so just hang on. So the way that this works is that anytime that we are flying, we are not required to be on oxygen unless we are at 12,500 feet MSL, and we have to be up there for at least 30 minutes. And if we are up there for 30 minutes or longer, then we are required to be utilizing supplemental oxygen. If we climb to 14,000 feet, we are required to be on supplemental oxygen immediately, at least for the flight crew. And at that point, it is just required. Now, flight crew is going to be anybody that is required to fly the aircraft. So flight engineer, it'll be captain, first officer, or second in command in the PIC as well. Now, for our passengers, we are not required to actually give them any type of oxygen until we get to 15,000 feet. And we have to offer it to them at 15,000 feet, but they do not have to actually accept it. All right. Now, what we're going to add to your knowledge bank here is going to be on the pressurized aircraft oxygen requirements. So there's 3 different requirements that we need to know. Now, this is directly from the regulation, but I'll kind of break it down into a nutshell. So you need to know the first 3 that we talked about, which is 12,500, 14,000, and 15,000. The other ones that we're going to deal with is that, as it states, no person may operate an aircraft with a pressurized cabin unless you have the 3 following things. So the very first one is that anytime that we are at flight level 250, remember flight levels, you're just going to add a couple zeros to that. So that's 25,000 feet. Anytime that you're flying above flight level 250, you need to have an additional 10 minutes of oxygen for every occupant on board that aircraft. Now, keep in mind that even if you are flying an airplane that has, let's say, 10 seats, but only 1 person is on board, that applies for all 10 seats. So you need to make sure that you meet this requirement. Manufacturers are well aware of this, so usually it's all built in. The second one that we also need to know about is basically when we hit flight level 350. So this is basically stating that if a pilot leaves the cockpit The other must have supplemental oxygen on, so you have to physically be wearing your mask unless you have the ability to have a quick donning mask. We'll talk about a quick donning mask here in the next slide, but that's effectively what it says. Now, most of the time, though, honestly, a quick donning mask is one, as it states in the regulation. You have to be able to apply it with a single hand within 5 seconds, and it has to fit and secure to your face properly. All right. The third regulation is anytime that we are above flight level 410, each pilot must be on oxygen at all times. That is the rule, but I can honestly tell you, I don't think any airline pilots actually follow that rule. So these are the ones that you kind of need to know. So just remember, the first one is anytime that we are at flight level 250, you're going to need an additional 10 minutes per passenger, okay? Anytime that we are at flight level 350, then what you'll need is that you either need to wear the mask. So I'll just say wear mask, or have a quick donning mask. And that's basically when the other pilot leaves. Let's say they use the restroom, gets a coffee, something along those lines. And the last one is dealing with flight level 410. So anytime that we are at flight level 410 or higher, then both pilots must wear basically oxygen for all pilots. All right, so that's how that breaks down. All right, let's go ahead and continue. Just 5 more slides, and then we're going to take that break. Okay. So with oxygen systems here, there's 3 different components to the oxygen system that we're going to talk about. There's a storage system, which is the container itself. We have a delivery system, and then it's going to be the mask or nasal cannula in terms of how is it actually delivered to us. For all the purposes, we use something called ABO, which is aviator breathing oxygen. There are a lot of different types of oxygen out there. You've got medical grade, you have aviator breathing oxygen, and you also have welding oxygen. They're all, at least the medical and the aviator, they're all good to use. But the biggest difference here is it has a very, very low dew point. And what will end up happening is that it really, really allows, because that low moisture content, it really is not going to freeze. That's kind of the big thing. If we take this thing up to altitude and it's very, very cold out, usually on the -30 to -40 point, if we took medical grade oxygen up there, it will freeze, which is what we don't want. The 3 different types of oxygen delivery systems are going to be the continuous flow, diluter demand, and the pressure demand. So the continuous flow is just that. It will continuously flow. It's not very efficient when you're doing that. So whether you're inhaling or exhaling or pausing between breaths, you're still going to get that consistent flow, and they're usually good for 28,000 feet or lower. The diluter demand is just that. It's oxygen on demand anytime you inhale. So it's kind of nice because it does save the oxygen supply, allows it to stretch a little bit more. In addition to that, because it is diluted, so the demand portion is basically pausing between breaths. The diluter portion is allowing it to combine the cabin air with the oxygen that's going into the system. Most of the diluter demand will basically say, do you want to mix it with cabin air, or do you want it to be 100% oxygen? System is generally going to be used up to 40,000 feet. So that's usually where it's good for. And the final one is known as pressure demand. So pressure demand is just positive pressure. It's forcing air into your lungs. So this is the stuff that you're usually going to see the fighter jets use. We have it on the airlines as well. We were primarily using it in the airlines in the event that there's smoke or anything in the cabin or cockpit. And it's really, really intended to kind of slightly inflate or overinflate the lungs. And this is what allows you to fly at or above 40,000 feet. And it's going to be 100% oxygen without any type of mixing of the cabin pressure, all right, the cabin altitude. The 3 different types of mask or nasal canals are going to be as follows. We have obviously the nasal cannulas, usually the things we usually see on TV or when you go to the hospital. So the big thing you need to know about this is their continuous flow. If you've got it on, it's going to continuously flow in between breaths, but it's only good up to 18,000 feet. So that's the big limitation that you need to know. The oral nasal rebreather is basically a full face mask, but it's got the little baggie at the bottom. This is usually in the airlines when we say that oxygen is flowing, but the bag may or may not inflate. The whole purpose is that it's giving you 100% oxygen. So it's the bag is going to inflate and basically store slightly additional amount of oxygen. These are good up to 25,000 feet. And the last two that we're going to talk about is a quick don mask. So these are the one-handed ones that you're going to find in business jets and airlines. These are the ones that we're trained on. You can kind of see these little red tabs here. Kind of works the same way in the Embraer. We're able to reach down with one hand, grab the red tabs. What will end up happening is those red tabs, when you push on it, will pressurize this little ring that goes around the guy's head or gal's head. Is just filled with air. So when you push it, it basically pressurizes that ring. So you can, it basically makes a wide opening and then you can put it over your face in 5 seconds or less. All right. So big thing here is you have to be able to don it 5 seconds or less. It does accommodate prescription glasses and it's rated up to 40,000 feet. And then the last one we're going to talk about is the airline drop-down units, the Dixie cups. This is basically providing 100% oxygen, a minimum of 10 minutes as required by law. Most systems are 12 to 15 minutes. The actual device that's giving you the oxygen, though, when you pull down on the mask, it's usually a chemically activated system. So when you're pulling down on that mask, that is what activates that chemical or releases or combines that chemical together, which basically produces the oxygen. And that's the reason why, any type of airline or pilot in command is basically trying to get down to a breathable flight level within a reasonable amount of time. Usually we're trying to get back down to 10,000 feet because the passenger systems only have a finite life of that 10 or 12 minutes. For the pilots themselves in the airlines, we usually have about a 2 to 3 hour limit, depending on if we have an observer or not. These are good enough for up to 40,000 feet. Let's see here. All right, let's do this. Let's do 3 more slides. 3 more slides and I got it. We're almost out. Okay. All right, so with this, let's look at the FAA test question here. This is dealing with oxygen requirements. What are the oxygen requirements when operating at cabin pressure altitudes above 15,000 feet? So at 15,000 feet, your options are A, oxygen must be available for flight crews. B, oxygen is not required at any altitude in a balloon, kind of unusual. Or C, the flight crew and passengers must be provided with supplemental oxygen. So Stephen, with the corporate flights above 45,000 feet, all requirements have to be met, and you're going to have the quick donning masks for the pilots, and then usually for the passengers, it will be the oral nasal. It's usually actually going to be the drop-down style for those as well. Although most of the corporate jets out there are going to have like a portable breathing unit, kind of like what the flight attendants would use for those passengers. Please use the poll. Please use the poll. Give everyone another minute. Then we've got 3 more slides, and then we're doing that break, everyone. Appreciate you hanging in there. Just want to finish this little section here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up right there. So 83% of the class with the correct answer, which is going to be C. It's the flight crew and passengers must be provided with supplemental oxygen. Okay. So, it's not looking for the exact wording, but that is the closest thing that we have. And let's go ahead and move on. Last topic that we're going to talk about before the break here is just the anti-ice and de-ice systems. There's a few different ones that I want you to be aware of for the purposes of the test. And the ones that we need to know are primarily, what is the difference between anti-ice and de-ice? So anti-ice equipment is designed to prevent the formation of ice, and de-ice is designed to remove the ice once it's actually accumulated or formed. Now, most of us out there in our training aircraft, the only you're usually going to get asked this on the check ride is what type of anti-ice or de-ice equipment do you have on board? For most of us in a Cessna or a Piper, which is the generic training aircraft, we do actually have something on board. The first one that we have is the pitot heat, which is actually a combination of anti-ice and de-ice. It is there to prevent buildup, and also in the event that it does accumulate, it will also remove the ice. The second thing that we also have on board that is not really effective, but it is something, it's better than nothing, is we obviously have cabin heat. And cabin heat would be primarily used for the defroster, so you can potentially see out the window. And then the third one, if you're flying a carbureted engine, you obviously have carburetor heat. Now, the other ones that are going to be a little bit new for most people out there are going to be the de-ice boots. So the de-ice boots is just a kind of a fabric that sits over the leading edge of the wing. Occasionally, it'll also be on the horizontal stabilizer, and it will cover the leading edge. As you can see here, the tube, when it's deflated, kind of looks like a smooth shape. And when it inflates, it kind of has these ridges, and it looks like this. So what will end up happening is when you inflate it, it's breaking apart the ice, and that ice is then carried away in the jet stream. If you ever have a chance to basically fly these in some of the older King Airs or those types of things, they'll talk about preventing an ice bridge, meaning that if you do this at the inappropriate times or you do it too often, what will end up happening is you could potentially get ice to form in between the cracks to the point where it creates an ice bridge. So if I were to look at kind of the side of the wing or the leading edge of the wing here, you could potentially have ice that kind of forms around that device. So when it expands and contracts, it's not actually breaking up the ice, and that's what we call an ice bridge. The next one is going to be the weeping wing. That's probably the most common in general aviation, especially with the Cirruses. So this is basically a combination of like a mixture of ethyl glycol or isopropylene alcohol. You can also throw rubbing alcohol in the system if you're really cheap. And you'll see it if you look really, really closely at a Cirrus, the ones that are equipped with the TKS system or the weeping wing, you'll see a lot of these little tiny pinholes. And what will end up happening is it has a reservoir that you fill up. It's usually a couple gallons, and when you turn the system on, some systems you manually have to turn on and some are automatic. But when the system is on, it will basically weep, right? And it looks like it'll basically continuously push out this fluid, and the whole purpose is to de-ice and anti-ice the system, all right? The next one that we have is going to be the propeller ice control. So these are going to be a few different options. We have prop ice control and windshield ice control. The prop ice control is also called a prop anti-ice boot, and it's generally going to be electric. You can kind of see, we obviously have the prop here in silver, and then the boot is this thing right there. And the reason why it doesn't go the entire length of it is it will start to heat up. And remember, the centrifugal force of the blade is supposed to actually throw the ice basically off the blade itself. But it will usually start heating up at the prop base, and then there's an inboard and outboard section as well. The windshield ice control, there's a couple different versions as well. So we already talked about the defroster, which is really not that effective, maybe in very, very mild amounts of ice. But there are also a kind of like that weeping wing that we talked about. There are systems that basically have an alcohol-based system that basically will spray it onto the windshield or continuously have it flow on the windshield. And that is used to basically coat the windows. In addition to that, there are aircraft out there that have electrically heated windows, and that could be the entire window itself. Or if you look at a window, occasionally what you'll do is on one side, you'll see a very, very small square, and that little square is electrically heated element. It's usually going to be on the captain's side, and it's a very, very small opening that allows them to see forward. Obviously, it's better than nothing, but at the end of the day, obviously you'd prefer to have the large entire window element to be heated. All right. All right, last one we're going to talk about is the larger jet systems, which is going to be the thermal anti-ice systems or de-ice systems. So what we end up doing here is these are really taking from basically any type of turbine aircraft. So turbine aircraft have several different stages inside of their engines. So usually we're taking from the 10th or the 15th stage this hot air, and we call it bleed air. So this bleed air is then kind of taken from those engines, and we use it for several different things. We use it for the heating of the aircraft. We use it for pressurization. That's kind of a big thing we use it for, but we can also reroute it. And what we do is it's too hot to use directly from the engine. So we basically mix it with colder outside air. And once it's at the appropriate temperature, then it's routed through a series of ducts and pipes to the leading edge of the wing, as you can see here. And what ends up happening is that will heat up the leading edge surface and allow any ice buildup to either dissipate or basically not attach itself in the near future. Once again, there's a controller on anytime. In most of these airplanes, there's going to be a controller. And some of the older aircraft, it will be manual. I know, let's say the Embraer, because that's what I used to fly, it was all automatic. So what ended up happening is it would say, it would tell us in the CAS messages, it will tell us that, there's an ice, I think it says ice protection. And then the system was designed to stay on for, I believe it was either 5 minutes or 7 minutes beyond the time that the last known icing potential event would occur. Okay. So those are the different types of systems in terms of the advanced systems. That's really all you need to know for the purposes of the check ride. But with that, let's go ahead and take a quick 10-minute break here. So appreciate everyone hanging in there a little bit extra. So let's come back at 38 minutes past the hour, and then we're going to finish with federal aviation regulations. All right, I'll see everyone in 10. All right, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully everyone got to stretch their legs, grab a bite to eat. Thanks again for hanging in there, just so we can kind of finish that section off. But what we're going to be doing for the rest of the class is we're going to be talking about federal aviation regulations. And as mentioned, we're going to talk about the ones that are pretty much universal. And then we're also going to be talking about the ones that are specific to the new stuff that we need to talk about, which is basically the commercial aspect as well. So with that, we are going to go ahead and get started here. Let's try to keep the chat professional and to the point. I know the moderators can deal with that stuff, but let's go ahead and see what we can do to remove these folks. Let's see here. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and get going. Let's get started, everyone. So as we know, there's primarily 3 different regulations that we are going to be talking about, or 3 different areas of the regulation. Anytime that we talk about the regulation, it's always going to be Code of Federal Regulations, and it's Section 14. So when you see 14 CFR, that is the section for basically aeronautics, and it basically covers the FAA regulations. It also covers NASA, the administration of NASA, so it is fairly broad. And then if you go to 13 or if you go to 15, it's going to be a completely separate area. But anyways, for us, we are 14 CFR, and then we have the 3 different parts that we're going to be talking about. So part 1 is the definitions and abbreviations. And part 61 is obviously the certification of pilots and instructors. Primarily, it will be, how do you get licensed and what are your privileges and limitations, information about medicals, or how to get specific endorsements, such as a high performance endorsement, for example. And part 91 is going to be all of our general operating and flight rules. It covers most of the information for VFR and also IFR flight rules that will pertain. So what we're going to be doing is we aren't going to be going through all of them, but we're going to go through the ones that we need to kind of touch upon and talk about for the purposes of this course. So starting off with part 1, which are going to be the commonly used abbreviation terms for the purpose of this course. The first thing that we want to go ahead and talk about is what is the difference, what is an aircraft, number 1, and then what are the different categories of aircraft. So remember, we always have category and then we have class. So an aircraft, for the definition by the FAA, is just an aircraft is anything that flies. So that's a pretty broad term, but when you and I think of an aircraft, we're thinking of usually a fixed wing aircraft, but it is not so. When we talk about pilot certification, we're going to use this term category and then class. So for the purpose of this class, everything we're kind of revolving around, the category is going to be an airplane, and then the class is going to be either single engine land or multi-engine land, and then we also have single engine sea and multi-engine sea. The way that these are divided up are into the 7 different categories. So we have the airplane, we have glider, rotorcraft, which are helicopters, lighter than air or balloons, powered lift, powered parachute, and what is considered a weight shift control, which is kind of those little funky ones where you can move your body around to get the craft to do what you need it to do. So on your pilot certificate, as we all remember, it will tell you what is the category and class that you are capable of basically certified to fly in. Now, as we continue, we're going to look at in terms of the aircraft. As mentioned, we have additional 4 classifications of the class. So those classifications are going to be airplane single engine land, airplane single engine sea, airplane multi-engine land, and airplane multi-engine sea. So those are going to be your 4 classes within the category. If you look at other categories, some have subclasses, some do not. The reason why we're talking about this, though, is for the purposes of your currency. There are certain things in currency that you have to be current in for the category and class. And if it requires a type rating, you have to be current in it as well. So for the purposes of airmen, what we want to ask is which of these is a class of aircraft? So with respect to the certification of airmen, which is a class of aircraft? Is it A, airplane, rotorcraft, glider, lighter than air, B, single engine land, and C, multi-engine land and sea, or C, lighter than air, airship, hot air balloon, or air gas balloon? Give everyone a moment on that. Remember to answer in the poll, please. Right, got a couple more people chiming in here. All right, good job, everyone. So we got about 73% of the class with the correct answer. So correct answer here is going to be B. It is the single engine land and sea, multi-engine land and sea. Good job, everyone. All right, last definition that we need to know before we continue into actually part 61 is going to be pilot in command, which is also known as the PIC. So remember the PIC, which is hopefully you, it has the final authority and responsibility for the operation and safety of flight. So there's always going to be a pilot in command or someone designated with that role of pilot in command prior to the flight, and will have that kind of capability during the flight as well. In order to act as pilot in command, you have to hold the appropriate category, class, and if it applies, a type rating in order to conduct that flight. And those are the basics of what you need beyond the medical and everything else. Now, there is also something called a second in command. Second in commands will apply if the aircraft requires a second person or a second crew member. They have to be a required crew member in order to qualify as a second in command. So in the event that the pilot in command becomes incapacitated, the second in command then basically takes on the role of pilot in command, or PIC. At the end of the day, no matter what, even if you're flying with your buddy and you're both appropriately rated for that aircraft, one of you needs to be the pilot in command. Think of it this way: if there's ever an accident or incident, they're going to go to the pilot in command for additional information. So anytime that you're flying with an instructor, even though, if you're a private pilot or higher and you hold the appropriate licenses, you're logging PIC time, but the FAA and the NTSB is actually going to go to the instructor as the official pilot in command at the end of the day. So now that we're done with the definitions that we need to cover, we're going to go back to part 61. So part 61, as mentioned, is the certification of pilots. It's how we become certified. It also talks about the medical requirements as well. So there are three basic documents that we need to have on our persons as a commercial airline pilot. So this is, I put in the reference. If you want to look at the exact references, it'll be FAR 61.3. But the three different documents that we need are going to be a valid government issued ID. So that has to have some type of picture and your information on it. In addition to that, you have to have a medical, and we'll talk about the medical that's required here. And then you'll also need your actual pilot's license. Now, the regulation specifically states that it has to be in your possession or at least readily accessible. So that doesn't mean, it can be in your flight bag in the back or something along those lines, but you don't want to keep it in your car or anything like that. These three documents are up for grabs in the event that you have an inspection, whether it's an FAA safety inspector, law enforcement, or it could be NTSB or TSA. They also have the right to inspect the documents. Now, if we go back, there are some alcohol and drug rules here. We call these the bottle to throttle rule, which is 6115. And remember, the way that we do this is that it's 8 hours bottle to throttle, and you have to have at least less than 0.04% blood alcohol content, and not be under the influence of alcohol or drugs prior to basically acting as pilot in command. So the other thing, keep in mind that even though that this is the regulation, your employer may ask something different of you. Most of the airline industry out there, they either have a 10 or 12-hour rule, but this is the basics. Also, keep in mind that there are certain medications, over-the-counter medications such as NyQuil or Dayquil. A lot of the cough medications out there have significant amounts of alcohol in them. You should not be affected in the event you take a small teaspoon. Probably not going to be flying anyways at that point if you're sick. But if you are taking swigs of that stuff, just keep that in mind. Also, within the regulations, that if you are involved with any type of drug or alcohol offense, let's say you're stopped for a DUI or anything along those lines, you have to report that to the FAA within 60 days. Otherwise, it's actually, you could potentially get suspended or have your licenses revoked or denied for any future application if you don't do so. At the time of this writing, it says DUI, but I know they were talking about BUIs here, which is boating under the influence. I don't know if they'll add that or not. For acting as a commercial pilot, and the only thing we're talking about here is a commercial pilot, not an ATP pilot. So ATP is going to be a different set of rules. But to be a commercial airline pilot, this is 6123. You need at least a second-class medical to act in that capacity. It's still broken down into your age group. So if you are over 40 years old or 40 or higher, your second-class medical will be valid for 12 calendar months. After 12 calendar months, the medical will then downgrade, or the privileges, the rights and privileges of that medical will downgrade to a third class for the remainder of the 12 calendar months. The reason why we say it downgrades is you want to make sure you use that language. A lot of examiners don't like it when students, when they say, like, how long is your medical valid for? Well, it's valid for 12 calendar months, and then it goes to a third class medical for another 12 calendar months. It doesn't go to it because at the end of the day, whatever the AME basically writes here and basically says this is a second class medical, after 12 calendar months, he doesn't come back to your house and tear it up and then write third class medical on it. So it will always be a second class medical, or if you have a first class medical, it will always be a first class medical. It's just that the rights and privileges will change over time. For those under 40, it will be valid for 24 calendar months. And then the rights and privileges will downgrade to a third class privileges for the remaining 36 calendar months. Basically, at the end of the day, your medical in this capacity is good for 60 calendar months or 5 years. And for the second class medical, it's going to be valid for 24 calendar months or 2 years for the total validity. For the purposes of the check ride, though, you just need a third class medical. And the only time that there's also kind of a one waiver here. You can get away being a flight instructor, which even though that's a commercial activity, you can get away with a third class medical or basic med. Keep in mind that basic med is another option, but for most of the commercial flying out there, it's not really going to allow you to do what you want to do. All right, 6131, type and additional training. This is basically talking about the different endorsements that you may or may not need, which is going to be additional training. So these are all one-time endorsements that you're going to get from your instructor, and they fall in line with the following. We have a high-performance aircraft, and remember, a high-performance aircraft is an airplane that has, the FAA says 201 plus. So basically, greater than 200 or 201 horsepower or higher is considered a high performance aircraft. Complex aircraft is going to be one that has a constant speed prop, flaps, and also retractable landing gear. It has to have all three in order to qualify. So if it just has 2 out of 3, it's not considered a complex. Pressurized airplane capable of operating at high altitudes, which is just kind of your high altitude endorsement. So that is any aircraft that is pressurized and basically operates at flight level 250 or higher. And then the tailwheel aircraft, which is obviously, most of us are probably flying tricycle gear aircraft, but the tailwheel is the one with the baby wheel at the very back of the aircraft. For most of these, they're fairly easy. Probably the 2 easiest ones to get for the one-time endorsement, depending on when you started flying, are primarily going to be the high performance, and the complex can usually be done in about an hour, hour and a half checkout with a little bit of ground prior. The pressurized aircraft, airplane one, or the high altitude endorsement, that takes a little bit more training. And then the tailwheel one is really based on proficiency, but the average is 5 to 10 hours with an instructor. And you have to do certain takeoff and landings inside of that aircraft. For those of you that have been around for quite some time, if you have flown high performance and complex aircraft and other aircraft, and you have logged it in your logbook before these laws came into effect where they require these endorsements, you are actually grandfathered in and you're not required to get them. So I think it's like 93 or 94. If you've flown some of these before that, you're not required to basically get additional training. The other thing as well is talking about when a type rating is required. So type ratings are required for any aircraft over 12,500 pounds gross weight. They're also required for any turbine-powered aircraft that could be a turboprop or turbojet. And I think there's about 7 aircraft out there on the FAA list that don't necessarily meet the requirements of 1 and 2, but the FAA dictates that a type rating is required. All right. So let's go ahead and look at a question here. And this is going to be: the pilot in command is required to hold a type rating in which aircraft? Is it A, aircraft operated under an authorization issued by the administrator; B, aircraft having a gross weight of more than 12,500 pounds; or C, aircraft involved in ferry flights, training flights, or test flights? Give everyone a moment on that. All right, looks like we've got 92% of the class with the correct answer here. So correct answer is going to be B. It's aircraft having a gross weight of more than 12,500 pounds. Good job, everyone. All right, let's go ahead and continue here with part 61. So remember that once we have a license, and remember that license is valid indefinitely unless it's basically suspended, revoked, or superseded. But there's certain things that we have to do as pilots in order to, utilize that license or basically to remain current. And we basically call this currency. So I always like to start to kind of think about this linearly in terms of what do you need to fly by yourself, and then what do you need to fly with passengers, and then we'll talk about the IFR requirement. So every 24 calendar months, in order just to fly, you need to have at least a flight review. It used to be called a biannual flight review, but we've changed the terminology. Flight review consists of at least a minimum of an hour of ground and an hour of flight with an instructor. And then keep in mind, there's 2 different ways to avoid a flight review. You can participate in the FAA Wings program, which is a safety-related program. You can check it out, faasafety.gov. And participating in classes like this are ways that you can actually get Wings credits that will apply. In addition to that, if you obtain a new certificate or rating, that will reset the clock, and that way you can basically postpone doing a flight review for another 24 calendar months. In terms of recent flight experience, to act as PIC, if you're going to be carrying passengers, which is the purpose of this license, you basically have to have made at least 3 takeoff and landings within the preceding 90 days. As the sole manipulator, and keep in mind the big caveat here that a lot of people miss is going to be in the same category and class of the aircraft that you intend to fly. And if there's a type rating required with that, it's also in the same type. Now, with the daytime landings, they can actually be any style that you want. They could be touch and goes, full stop, taxi back, however you want to do it. Unless you're flying a tailwheel aircraft. If you're flying a tailwheel aircraft, they must be all made to a full stop. So that would basically take care of the daytime currency requirements. Nighttime currency requirements are basically the same thing, 3 takeoff and landings within the preceding 90 days as the sole manipulator of the controls in the appropriate category and class. But all of them have to be made to a full stop regardless of the aircraft. The other thing too is that for the purposes of nighttime, it's 1 hour after sunset ends and 1 hour before sunrise is when we can actually start counting the flight time. Now, if we were to kind of look at this in a little graph chart, this is kind of the breakdown. So the top stuff is the VFR. So we talked about the flight review every 24 calendar months. Your passenger landings are the daytime and then the nighttime. So keep in mind that your nighttime landings can count for your daytime, but your daytime cannot count for your nighttime landings. All right. At the very bottom here, if you do hold an instrument rating, you also need to make sure that you are current. Also keep in mind that really, I'd highly encourage you get an instrument rating, either, in conjunction with your commercial or before your commercial. There's not a lot of opportunities if you have a commercial license, but you don't have an instrument rating. There's some limitations there that we'll talk about coming up. And the other thing too is, really, you're going to be limited to like skydiving and certain activities that are kind of local. Now, these are the other currency requirements that you're going to have. So remember, we call it 6 hits. So that's 6 approaches, holding, intercepting, and tracking within 6 months. So you obviously have 6 months to retain that currency. If you go beyond 6 months, between the 6-month and 12-month marker, you can still maintain your currency, but you have to go up with either a CFI, CFII, a designated pilot examiner, or you can use a safety pilot like a buddy to kind of sit with you during that next 6 months. If you don't do that for 12 months, that's where you don't want to get into. But if you don't do any of your 6 approaches within the 12 months, that's when we need an IPC, which is an instrument proficiency check. That has to be done with a CFII or a designated pilot examiner. It's pass or fail, and it doesn't need to be done in one complete sitting. It could be stretched out over time. Honestly, it's easier just to maintain your currency. Also keep in mind with this FAA currency, these are all of the legal requirements or the minimums. On the last day of class, we'll talk about personal minimums and developing your own personal minimums that might be higher than what's required. If you kind of think about it, if you did 3 takeoff and landings on January 1st, and then 89 days later, you haven't flown, basically haven't flown in 89 days, if you went up to go take your entire family, you're probably not going to be that efficient or that great at takeoff and at least landings if you haven't touched the aircraft in a little over 2.5 months. So this is very much a use it or lose it, as we all know. So I would encourage you to kind of develop those personal minimums that we'll talk about next week. All right, let's go ahead and look at an FAA test question, talking about wonderful sunset here. So if a pilot, there we go. If a pilot does not meet the recency of experience requirements for night flight and official sunset is at 1900 CST, the latest time passengers should be carried is when? Is it 1959? 1900 or 1800? And Ray, the currency requirements are the same for private and commercial licenses. They are basically always going to be the same once you're a licensed pilot. Thanks, Santosh. Certificate. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap it up right there. So good job, everyone. Looks like we've got about 74% of the class with the correct answer, and correct answer is going to be A, which is 1959 CST. So remember, you can fly. Remember, basically nighttime takes effect 1 hour after sunset. So if the official sunset time is at 1900, basically at 2000 you couldn't carry passengers if you're not current. So you've got 59 minutes after sunset to basically park it or carry passengers, whatever you're doing in that regard. All right, let's go ahead and talk about the commercial pilot privileges. I'm going to go move to that one real quick here. So your commercial pilot privileges and limitations, they're going to build off of your private pilot privileges, except there's some new things you can and can't do. The biggest one, obviously, is going to be that you can act as pilot in command of an aircraft under the following circumstances. So you can carry passengers or property for compensation or hire, provided that you are qualified in accordance with this part. And what we're talking about with this part is, are you appropriately rated or typed on the aircraft? Do you have your currency met as well? All right. Your big limitation, if you do not hold an instrument rating in the same category and class, you're going to have this limitation written, and this will be verbatim on your pilot's license. And it says the carriage of passengers for hire in our case, it's airplanes on cross-country flights in excess of 50 nautical miles or night is prohibited. So if you do not have an instrument rating and you get your commercial pilot's license, you can't fly more than 50 miles away from your primary airport, and you're not allowed to carry passengers at night. So as you can see, not a lot of people are going to want to hire you. It really is fairly limiting at the end of the day. All right. So I would encourage you to get an instrument rating in conjunction with, or at least preferably before your commercial, but you could also do it after. The next thing we want to talk about is what is known as common carriage. So the way the FAA considers or describes common carriage it has to meet these 4 criteria, which is holding out or a willingness to hold out. We'll talk about holding out, which is just kind of saying advertising. That's a very simplified way of thinking about it. You have to basically advertise or hold out, transport people or property from place to place, and it has to be for compensation or hire. So when you hold out, this is essentially you advertising your services as a commercial pilot, okay? So unless you fall under Part 119, and I didn't put on the slide, but Part 119 would basically provides a list of exemptions. So some examples of these exemptions are if you're a flight instructor or doing flight instruction, if you're banner towing, crop dusting, or doing aerial photography, those would exempt you from basically advertising. So if you fall outside of that list, then what ends up happening is you're going to be designated as really an air carrier operation. So you're not allowed to hold out as a commercial pilot if you weren't doing one of those activities that I just described. So for example, if you're offering a friend a ride from point A to point B for compensation or hire, it isn't going to be legal. So if as I get my new license as a commercial pilot, and I put in a front page ad that basically says I fly from Los Angeles to Las Vegas, and I'm going to charge money for it, right? That is really not going to fly, and I cannot do that in terms of holding out, because I would need either a Part 135, which is a charter license, or a Part 121 certificate in order to operate in that capacity. Now, let's say I'm a flight instructor and I just got my commercial license and I've got my flight instructor certificate. I have the ability to hold out and basically put online that I am a flight instructor and I provide my services. I can absolutely do that in the commercial aspect. Now, the other thing too that gets a little convoluted is it all depends on who owns the airplane at the end of the day. So if a friend of mine comes up to me and says, hey, David, I'm going to pay you $2,000 to fly me from LA to Las Vegas. And let's say that I've got an airplane. If it's my airplane and they came up to me, I didn't hold out, I didn't advertise, it was just a friend of mine, I can accept that and fly them from Los Angeles to Las Vegas. If I didn't have an airplane and they asked me the same thing, and they said, well, why don't you go rent an airplane from the local flight school? Then I cannot do that because then it becomes a charter operation because I don't own the airplane, all right? Those are the big things. It's kind of like, do you own it or do you not own it? If the individual owns it and they want us to fly it, we can absolutely do that. But if they intend on renting it from a third party, or I intend on renting it from a third party, then it's going to fall outside of kind of that protected area. And it's going to fall it's going to lean more towards the air carrier operations like a Part 135 or Part 121. So let's see, William, you're saying, what if you offer your friend a ride from point A to point B? You do it not expecting compensation, but when you get there, he buys you dinner for the ride. That's perfectly acceptable, William. The main thing is that if you do this, and let's say you do this regularly, let's say you and your friend come to an agreement and your friend wants you to fly him, let's say from LA to Vegas, and he wants you to fly him every single week, right? If you start doing it regularly, if the FAA catches on, they could potentially send you that letter that says if you want to continue, you're going to have to stop and desist. And if you want to continue, then you're going to have to register as a 135 or 121. The challenge with the FAA is they don't stipulate how many times would be considered regular. So it could be once or it could be 10 times. But they catch on to this stuff fairly quickly. The other thing that you'll also notice is in safety inspectors, they do this quite a bit. They'll call random flight schools. And when they call the flight school, they'll say, hey, I've got a business meeting, let's say in San Francisco. Can you fly me up there? And what they're looking for is they're looking for the flight school person to basically screw up and say, oh, yeah, we can fly you up there. If they don't have a charter license or an air carrier operation license, we can't do that. And sometimes what the examiners will do would be, we can do it for the purposes of training, but, they need to actually be, working or progressing towards a license. We're not supposed to be flying people up under the skies of training, and they're not actually training. All right. So that should take care of that in terms of what we can do and what we can't do. If you have questions, let me know. Looks like most people were able to understand that, but at the end of the day, we are allowed to hold out if we are under this exempt group of Part 119. So just to recap, we can basically advertise our services if we're doing flight instruction, banner towing, crop dusting, aerial photography, those types of things. If we're kind of outside of any of those occupation groups that we just discussed, then you're not allowed to advertise. So I can't advertise and say I do daily flights somewhere or I do flights once a year. That's what I can't do. I can do that only if I have the appropriate licenses as an air carrier, and that depends on what type of air carrier that you want to be. So 121 or 135. Fernando's asking cargo. Yes, cargo is also included in air carrier operations. And AFRA, you can't do flight lessons on a rented plane. So you can do flying lessons on a rented plane as long as the owner allows it. All right. So let's go ahead and talk about another stipulation, kind of a roundabout way where you can do local flights carrying passengers. This is one that's frequently asked because it's kind of hidden the regulations and this is the one that most students miss on their check ride as well. So I would bookmark this one. It's 91-147. And what this allows is you can apply to your local FAA FSDO office. And what will end up happening is they'll ask you a series of questions. And it's really, really not intensive. You can do it and probably write the letter in 30 minutes and just answer the information. So what this allows is you can get a letter of authorization from your local FSDO. And what this will basically allow is it will allow local nonstop flights in a 25 statute mile radius from whatever the primary airport is. So this is usually good for like what we usually call them scenic flights. So if someone comes to the flight school, we can basically fly them around. It's not a flight lesson, so they're not actually physically controlling the airplane. We are basically providing a commercial service, but we're very limited in the sense of what we can and can't do. All of the pilots have to be listed or added to the letter of authorization, and each of those pilots have to obviously be qualified to fly that aircraft in the category, class, and type if necessary. And they must participate in the FAA drug testing program, which is just a randomized program, all right? So that's kind of really the only loophole out there, 91-147. But that is the big one that most people miss or don't quite understand. All right. So with that, let's go ahead and look at two more FAA test questions here. The first one is dealing with logging time as an SIC or second in command. So let me pull this one real quick. What flight time? All right, so you guys can read this one over while I find it. But what flight time may a pilot log as second in command? Give me 1 second while I find that one here. All right, think about that one for just 1 second. Looks like that was the only one that I didn't upload, so I'll just throw in A, B, or C real quick here. Question A, B, or C? All right, so make your choice, A, B, or C. There's the poll. Sorry, guys and gals, forgot to load it in there. I think that's one of the one I missed earlier. But what flight time may a pilot log as second in command? Is it A, all flight time while acting as second in command in aircraft configured for more than one pilot? B, all flight time when qualified and occupying a crew member station in an aircraft that requires more than one pilot? Or C, only that flight time during which the second in command is the sole manipulator of the flight controls? And going back to some of the other questions that people had here, aerial tours, Eric, if the aerial tour is within 25 statute miles, you can apply that 91-147. If it's outside of the 25 statute miles, then you're going to need probably a 135 license. Stephen, if you are an equity owner in a club, that is kind of a gray area. There's nothing that really says one way or the other. But if you have an equity share, or let's say you are named on the lease or something along those lines, then you can use that aircraft. It would basically be considered your own. But once again, that's kind of a gray area. If the individual owns an LLC that then owns the aircraft, John, that is still qualified as your aircraft. So if it's owned by the company, then you can use it. All right. Joel, 91-147, it's kind of like a mini 135, just like really nothing you can do. Keep in mind that if you wanted to, anybody can apply for a 135 or a 121 license, probably going to be along the lines of a 135, which is kind of on-demand operations. But it's really kind of a pain in the butt. You have to submit your policies, your flight manuals, your maintenance records. I mean, it's kind of a big production to get a 135 certificate. But if you can do it, then more power to you. All right, everybody, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the poll here. We got about 47% of the class with the correct answer, and correct answer here is B. It's all flight time when qualified and occupying a crew member station in an aircraft that requires more than one pilot. So it has to require more than one pilot. There are some business jets out there that do require more than one pilot, but they are then certified for single pilot operations. If it is certified for single pilot operations, even though it has 2 seats, you're not going to be able to log SIC time. This is a big problem where people go to the airlines and they have all of this SIC time logged, but then what ends up happening is it's not really legal time that you can log, and then they end up having to go back and finish their flight time in some other way. And the other thing too is if there are two crew members that are required to fly that aircraft, it is not, the reason why C is not correct is that the person doesn't have to manipulate the controls of the aircraft, right? You don't have to manipulate the controls of the aircraft to log the time for SIC. And then A there is also incorrect. We had about 39% where it says all flight time while acting as SIC and aircraft configured for more than one pilot. Slightly different wording in that one. So correct answer, everyone, is going to be B. All right. Let me just see if there's any other questions here. For the purposes of a CFI, Fernando's asking, do we log SIC? We do not log SIC for CFIs. The nice thing about being a flight instructor is we are always logging PIC time. It doesn't matter what student we're training, whether it's a student pilot or, an ATP pilot. The only thing that we're more limited in when it comes to actually logging things in our logbook for flight instructors is going to be when we log approaches. So if we're a CFII, we can only log the approach as our own if we're actually in IMC conditions past the final. All right. All right. Let me go and look at the next test question here, which is also dealing with flight time as well. Let me go ahead and bring this one up. All right. So the next one is. All right, so what flight time must be documented and recorded by a pilot exercising the privileges of commercial? Give me 1 second. Let me bring this one up. Or I'll just do the same thing. We'll just do this. Serves the same purpose. Is it A, flight time showing training and aeronautical experience to meet requirements for a certificate rating or flight review? B, all flight time flown for compensation or hire? Or C, only the flight time for compensation or hire with passengers aboard, which is necessary to meet the recent requirement? Thanks, Stuart. Leaf. So you're asking about a PA 28181, which is basically an Archer. Yeah, it doesn't require two pilots, so you're not going to be able to log SIC time in that. The FAA has a list of all aircraft that are SIC, and there are some SIC aircraft or aircraft that require two pilots, but they have the capability of being certified for single pilot operations. As soon as they are certified for single pilot operations, then you can't log SIC time anymore. They do have a new program out that allows you to log SIC time only for the purposes of accumulating 1,500 hours towards your ATP, but that's really all it counts for. All right, I'm going to end the poll there. We got a split class, 49% with A, 42% with B. Correct answer here is actually going to be A. So B is incorrect. It's where you're basically saying all flight time flown for compensation or hire. That has no bearing on why we keep our logbooks. The only reason why we keep our logbook is really for if we are trying to meet an experience requirement for any type of certificate, rating, license, anything along those lines, or it's for your flight review purposes or for currency purposes as well. So you obviously, a lot of pilots don't keep track of every single flight. They only keep track of a couple of flights to meet or basically show that they meet the currency requirements. 3 more slides, then we're going to take a quick 5-minute break, then we'll wrap up everything. All right, next one we're going to get into is Part 91 operations. As we know, a lot of people say 61 is how to get your license, 91 is how to lose it, but these are all of your general operating flight rules, kind of the how-to guides of everything. First one we're going to look at is probably the easiest and most simplistic rule out there, which deals with pilot and command authority. So remember, you have the same authority as that captain sitting in that 747 right up there. So you are ultimately responsible for safety of flight, and you basically have the final authority to the operation of that aircraft. All right. So if there's any type of emergency that requires any type of immediate action, you, the pilot, can basically deviate from any rule of Part 91, as long as it's to the extent required to meet that emergency. All right. Anytime you deviate from that rule, though, keep in mind that you may, and it's not required, but you may be asked to provide a written report of the deviation. Okay. All right. So luckily, one of the most simple rules out there, most of these are kind of convoluted the way that the lawyers write them. But luckily, that's actually a pretty simple one. All right, let's go ahead and look at an FAA test question here, and then we'll take a quick break. So if an in-flight emergency requires immediate action, the pilot in command may do what? Is it A, deviate from any rule of Part 91 to the extent required to meet the emergency, but must submit a written report to the administrator within 24 hours? B, deviate from any rule of Part 91 to the extent required to meet that emergency, or C, not deviate from Part 91 unless prior to the deviation approval is granted from the administrator. Hamza is asking, what does it take to become an aerial photographer? There's a lot of companies out there. Once you get your commercial license, they'll hire you at 250 hours. They actually have you fly all around the country, and usually like a small Cessna or something like that. And they'll give you, aerial assignments. It's not that difficult as long as you have the flight time. Daniel is saying that you cannot use your own plane to fly passengers for hire. It has to belong to the passengers. That's incorrect, Daniel. If you own the airplane, or if the passenger owns the airplane, or the person that's hiring you owns the airplane, you can use that. So it's mainly if someone asks you to fly from point A to point B and you didn't own an airplane, you can't go rent an airplane for the purposes of meeting that requirement. Okay. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap it up right there. We got 85% there with the correct answer, which is B. So correct answer is to deviate from any rule of Part 91 to the extent required to meet that emergency. All right, good job, everybody. What we're gonna do is take a quick 5-minute break here. So it's rolling over to 27. Let's come back at 32 past the hour. Then what we'll do is we will continue with the Part 91 and wrap it up. All right, see everyone in just a few. All right, everybody, welcome back. Hopefully you got to stretch your legs. We're going to go ahead and continue with part 91. With this section, really the only thing we have left is just a couple regulations that we need to touch base on. It's going to be some transponder requirements and ADS-B requirements, and there's also going to be obviously airworthiness and then NTSB regulations, which is kind of the big one at the very end. All right, so continuing on here, we all know that we need an airworthiness certificate, which is just one of the required documents. It's 91.7. It has to be visible unless you get a waiver. But for general aviation, we pretty much all have them visible. It's going to be this, and the registration has to be visible to the pilot and or occupants of the aircraft. Keep in mind that the airworthiness certificate does not imply that the airplane is actually airworthy. And it never expires. I always kind of think of it like the way I explain it to students is it's kind of like the birth certificate of the airplane. The one thing that I will tell you is that airworthiness itself, this is kind of the equation that I like to think of, is aero, which is basically our documents, plus aviated, or however you learned it, AVIATED, which is all of our inspections. And if I also add in there in operative equipment, meaning we went out to the plane and we looked at the plane and nothing was broken, if you add up all of these things, that basically means that the aircraft would be considered, it would have its airworthiness or be airworthy, all right? So when we're looking at airworthiness, we're basically ensuring that all documents are on board that are required, which we'll look at here in a few minutes. We're making sure that all the inspections as per whatever we're flying are basically completed. And when we actually physically go out to the plane, and this is usually what people get wrong, is they usually say, well, it's just the documents and the inspections. But when we physically go out to the plane and we do the pre-flight and we ensure that there's nothing that could be broken that is a no-go item, then the airplane is officially considered airworthy at that point in time. All right. So let's go ahead and continue here. The other one is going to be 91.1.9, and this deals with all of our flight manuals, markings, and placards. This kind of falls under the arrow under operating limitations. So think about it this way: where are all of our operating limitations? And they're going to be located in our approved flight manual or POH, depending on what your airplane has. It will also be found in your instrument markings. So remember your airspeed indicator, the color coding on the airspeed indicator, the limits that are on the oil pressure gauge, the oil temperature gauge. All of these different flight instruments are providing us information on limitations. In addition to that, it's all the placards and markings in the airplanes as well. So the placards are everything from like the no smoking sign, to the avgas only on the wingtips, by the fuel filler. All of those things are considered to be limitations, and they all have to be checked, and those are all required to be there. Going back to your private pilot days, you probably remember this one, 91.1.5. You're allowed to drop an object or anything. So remember, as pilot in command, you can drop anything you want from the airplane as long as it doesn't create any type of hazard to anybody below, whether that's a human being or property itself. The important one that we always want to consider is 91.103. We use an acronym for this known as Northwest Craft, NW Craft. And remember that at the end of the day, the pilot in command, you have the ultimate responsibility and authority of the flight, but it's also up to you to make sure that you become familiar with all available information pertaining to that flight itself. When you kind of go up to the airlines, the pilot in command still has this responsibility, but it is a shared responsibility. So at least for Part 121 in the airlines, the dispatcher and the captain or the pilot in command have a joint responsibility for pre-flighting the aircraft, because it's usually the dispatcher that's doing the weight and balance. They're doing the fuel planning, they're doing the flight planning, and all that stuff. It's generally going to be when the flight crew gets to the aircraft, there will be a pre-printed packet with all the information, with the weather, the NOTAMs, the flight information. If there's something that the captain doesn't like, they can work or call the dispatcher and see if they maybe want to move things around. Maybe it's a flight plan or something like that. But you don't have to actually work as hard when you get to the airlines compared to if you're doing this all by yourself. A couple important things here is if you're doing a flight not in the vicinity of your departure airport, you have to check the weather reports and forecasts. You have to check fuel requirements, alternates if they're required, primarily on the instrument side. And you also have to look at any type of known ATC delays. So that is anytime that we are not, we're basically departing the vicinity of our local airport environment. Any airport that we go to, whether it's our home airport or any airport that we intend on landing, we have to check the runway lengths and basically make sure that our performance information allows us to go in and out of that, specific airport. So remember, Northwest Craft is kind of, as mentioned, the acronym that we use. We've got NOTAMs. We'll talk about all the different types of NOTAMs in a different class. Then there is the actual weather. So your METARs, your TAFs, SIGMETs, AirMets, everything else in between. Known ATC delays. So remember, primarily going to be larger aircraft, usually going to be class Bravo aircraft. Bravo airspace, that is. And when you're going into those larger airports, there's usually what we call flow control, which means that there's usually landing spots or slots. So if there's a 30-minute delay, you want to make sure that you're planning accordingly, especially with your fuel planning as well. Runway lengths required for any airport that you go to. Alternate airports, remember that is, you never, ever need an alternate for VFR. It's wise to have one, but you are required to have an alternate if you're flying IFR, depending on the 1, 2, 3 rule, and or if it doesn't have an instrument approach, remember you're required to have an alternate airport. Your fuel requirements, make sure you have enough, and then your takeoff landing performance data. All right. So let's go ahead and look at an FAA test question here, which is dealing with the actual pre-flight itself. Give me just one moment. I'll bring this one up. So the required pre-flight action relative to weather reports and fuel requirements is applicable to, is it A, any flight conducted for compensation or hire, B, any flight not in the vicinity of the airport, or C, IFR flights only? Think about what we just talked about. Got it, Santosh. You guys are talking about balloons, it looks like. I think I missed that. They also have those really cool science experiments. I kind of saw there's a cool website where you could, for like $100, you could get a weather balloon and build this kind of like cheap igloo thing. Get like a really cheap disposable cell phone and basically tie it to a GoPro. So that basically tracks it. And I think you need the FAA permission or some type of permission just to launch it. But I guess these things would go up into the atmosphere, go to 50, 60,000 feet, and then they would pop and then just parachute back to the ground. And some people have some pretty amazing GoPro footage from it. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll right there. Looks like we have 73% of the class with the correct answer, which is gonna be B here. It is any flight not in the vicinity of the airport. We really hadn't, A and B have nothing to do with the weather reports, all right? All right, let's go ahead and continue here. We're gonna talk about seatbelts real quick here. So crew use of seatbelts. Remember that anytime that you are at your required station, you are required to have some type of seatbelt on. And that's really going to be at all times. For most of us in our small general aviation aircraft, we don't have any place to go, so it's not really a big deal. The one thing, though, is going to be that if there is a shoulder harness, you're required to use the shoulder harness during takeoff and landing, unless it interferes with your duties. I've worked with some students in the past, especially like in the Pipers, because they're manual flaps. They have to reach forward towards the ground and pull up a lever. If it if it is interfering, just don't use it. If you're having trouble reaching the panel or anything along those lines, I've seen students buckle themselves in and it becomes restrictive. So don't worry about it at that point. 91-107, dealing with seatbelts again, but for passengers. So remember, as pilot in command, you are responsible now to brief the actual passengers themselves on how to utilize the seatbelts and shoulder harnesses. The other things that you also want to brief them on is fire extinguisher usage, emergency exits, how to open the doors, air vents, watching out for traffic, basically sterile cockpit, whatever else you want to tell them at the end of the day. All right. So with that, let's go ahead and look at an FAA test question here revolving around seatbelts. So with respect to passengers, what obligation, if any, does the PIC have concerning the use of safety belts? Is it A, the pilot in command must instruct passengers to keep their safety belts fastened for the entire flight? B, the pilot in command must brief the passengers on the use of safety belts and notify them to fasten their safety belts during taxi, takeoff, and landing? Or C, the pilot in command has no obligation in regard to passenger use of safety belts? 100%, please. Raquel, vicinity. We don't really have a specific definition or FAA definition for vicinity. And Johnny, in terms of so for a flight crew member, it's during takeoff, landing, and en route, you need to be at your seat. That's really the only requirement. But anytime that you're at your station or your seat, you're required to have your seatbelt on. So pilots or flight crew members have to be buckled in at all times, and also utilizing their shoulder harnesses if it doesn't interfere with their duties. All right, everybody, I'm going to go ahead and wrap that one up. We got 95% of the class with the correct answer. So correct answer, once again, is B. It's the pilot in command must brief the passengers on the use of safety belts and notify them to fasten their safety belts during taxi, takeoff, and landing. All right, good job, everyone. All right, let's go ahead and look at operating near other aircraft. You might do this as a commercial pilot, but you are not allowed to operate next to another aircraft if it's going to basically create any type of potential hazard. And if you end up operating next to another aircraft, such as in this example, a formation flight, you can only do so with prior arrangement with the other pilot in command of those other aircraft. All right, so pretty simple rule. Next one we're going to talk about is right-of-way rules. So remember, as VFR pilots and IFR pilots, doesn't really matter, our primary rule of thumb and our responsibility is basically to see and avoid other traffic. If we're in IMC conditions, then that action is basically deferred to air traffic control. But even if we are on an IFR flight plan and it's nice and clear skies, that is still reverted back to the pilot in command to see and avoid. Now, at the end of the day, it is the aircraft on your right, just like, when we're dealing with automobiles, the car on your right is going to be the person that has the right of way. And then the right-of-way is also defined by the actual craft itself or the category of aircraft as well. All right. No special certification rusts to fly in formation. And the cutting age for commercial pilot Samuel is 18. So with the right-of-way, the acronym that we use is ABGAR. So A, B, G, G, A. So what we have is aircraft in distress. So basically any aircraft that's declared emergency has a right of way over all other aircraft. And then it really comes down to maneuverability. So it goes from least maneuverable to most maneuverable. So obviously the balloon is next. It's going to go wherever the wind takes it. They really don't have much control other than that, except for altitude. Then we've got glider undertow. Then we have a glider itself, airship. Then it is going to be the airplane, helicopter, and the microlights. Okay. When we are potentially overtaking an aircraft, we're always supposed to pass to the right. And you also want to make sure that you are well clear of that aircraft. Don't pass to the right of that aircraft 10 feet away, as we all know. Try to give them a quarter of a mile or so, at least a couple thousand feet. Make sure that they don't know your intentions when we overtake someone. They may not even be paying attention to who's around them. So it behooves you to make sure that you're well clear and you're fairly visible while you basically execute that maneuver. All right. Let's see here. Let's go ahead and look at airspeeds next. So with our airspeeds, getting into the commercial world, I think the hardest thing that you kind of have to deal with, at least for me, was the whole 250 knots below 10,000 foot limit. That's something that for the life of me, it never applied when I was flying a general aviation plane. But as soon as I flew a jet, it was like, I always had to keep it on my mind and pre-plan. And, I would usually start slowing down like at 12,000 feet before I got to the 10,000 foot level. And especially when you get into faster aircraft and turbine powered aircraft, just because you pull the power back does not mean it's going to slow down when you want to. A lot of times it takes forever to slow down, or some of these aircraft are so slippery that they seem to, in a way, speed up. Okay. Now, the aircraft speed, remember these rules. So anytime that we are above 10,000 feet MSL, there is no speed limit. There is one rule out there that is basically just as long as it doesn't create a sonic boom or faster than the speed of sound. That is kind of the only rule that we have above 10,000 feet. Below 10,000 feet across anywhere in the United States, it is going to be 250 knots. And remember, everything that we're talking about is going to be indicated. It's not based on ground speed or true airspeed. It's indicated airspeed. Inside of Class Bravo airspace, it is also 250 knots. Anytime that we are in Class Charlie or Delta airspace, it's 200 knots. And with the other one within Class Charlie and Delta, the one that people usually confuse is the exact wording on the regulation is that it is at or below 2,500 feet above the surface within 4 nautical miles of the primary airport in Class Charlie and Delta airspace is the 200 knot rule. Okay. Anytime that we are below Class Bravo airspace, or if there's a VFR corridor, not every Class Bravo has a VFR corridor. In LA, we've got a bunch of them, and they're designated. You're going to find them on the TAC charts, but that is going to be 200 knots as well. All right. Moving on to minimum safe altitudes, which is 91, 119. There's 3 different rules that we're going to talk about here. Rule number 1 is basically a catch-all rule where no person may operate an aircraft below an altitude allowing an emergency landing to be made without undue hazard to persons or property on the surface in the event of an engine failure. Usually the FAA has kind of this generalized rule, and they're able to tell, especially people on the ground. A lot of people will call the FAA and say someone's buzzing my house or too low. They usually have a photograph of some or something along those lines. The tail numbers on the side of aircrafts, they're usually going to be a standardized size. And if you can basically take a picture or see that tail number clearly with the naked eye, that means that they're going to be roughly 500 to 1,000 feet. So, if you're higher than that, you're not going to be able to see the tail number unless someone's using a telephoto lens. That's kind of how they judge the criteria, at least when I was talking to a safety inspector here out of LA. All right, rule number 2 is we're going to be talking about congested areas, and then we'll also be talking about non-congested areas, or basically sparsely populated areas. Congested areas are going to be any type of cities or towns. Just kind of think of it as, either rural versus suburban. And when we're looking at this, when we're talking about a congested area, you have to be at least 1,000 feet above the highest obstacle, or at least the ground in this case. And then if you're getting closer to the city and there's a larger building, you need to be 2,000 feet horizontally away from that object. So for most of us out there, if we're not flying, let's say in a downtown area, it will be 1,000 feet MSL, or I'm sorry, 1,000 feet AGL. And then in this circumstance, we have a building here, which is 750 feet tall. So the pilot then has to add an additional 1,000 feet. So this pilot is actually flying at 1750, and they are 2,000 feet horizontally away from that structure. All right. Now, keep in mind, at the end of the day, there's always that rule number one, which is the catch-all. So if you still don't think that's safe enough, you might need to be higher in order to avoid any type of as stated, any type of situation that's going to cause a hazard to either persons or property below. Anytime we're dealing with sparsely populated areas, these could be farmland or anything along those lines, or even open waters. This is kind of rule number 3. It's 500 feet over any basically person, property, vessel, anything along those lines. So if you're flying over farmland, it'll be 500 feet. You also need to be 500 feet in any given direction from any, as stated, property, whether that's human beings or it is a vessel of some type. But other than that, there is no other rule beyond that. So if you're over open water, so if you have open water, you could theoretically, you could be flying right above the surface at 5 feet or 2 feet above the actual ground. But let's say you've got a cool little ship over here. As soon as you get close to that ship, you've got to be 500 feet in all directions. And remember, this is over open water or sparsely populated area. So at that point, your aircraft will be slightly higher in these circumstances. And then if you want to go back to that lower position, you can. Keep in mind, though, rule number 1, that's probably if you lose an engine and you're 5 feet over water, you're obviously not going to make a safe landing. In addition to that, God forbid you actually catch a wave or a wave starts to come up a little bit higher, you're going to be in trouble in that case. All right. Now, this rule does not apply anytime that we're taking off or landing. So that's another thing to kind of think about as well. The open assembly of people, we're not allowed to fly over an open assembly of people. That's primarily kind of getting into the aerobatic rule, though. All right. Let's see here. Yep, that's my yacht. That is my yacht. It's probably like a little dinghy, though, at the end of the day. All right, what we're going to do is look at another FAA test question here, which is talking about minimum safe altitudes. Let me go ahead and bring this one up here. So, except when necessary for takeoff or landing, what is the minimum safe altitude required for a pilot to operate an aircraft over other than a congested area? Is it A, and I should say an altitude, it's not an altitude allowing if a power unit fails an emergency landing without undue hazard to persons or property on the surface. B, an altitude of 500 feet AGL except over open water or a sparsely populated area, which requires 500 feet from any person, vessel, vehicle, or structure. Or C, an altitude of 500 feet above the highest obstacle with a horizontal radius of 1,000 feet. What was the question about the FE time? Was that Missy or Santosh that said something about flight engineer time? I think I missed that. All right, got about, I think if you guys can give me about 15 more minutes, we'll be able to finish everything. For those on the East Coast, I know it's getting a little late for you guys. Remember, the video will be posted a little bit later tonight. You'll get an email reminding you. So you're more than welcome to watch it anytime over the weekend between classes. All right, let's go ahead and wrap this one up. We have 62% of the class with the correct answer here. And correct answer is B. It's the altitude of 500 feet AGL, except over open water or a sparsely populated area, which requires 500 feet from any person, vessel, vehicle, or structure. Okay, good job, everyone. Going back to our altimeter settings here. This is 91,121. So remember, our transition level, at least in the United States, is going to be at 18,000 feet MSL. Anything above 18,000 feet, we should be immediately turning our altimeter to standard, which is 29.92 inches of mercury. Other than that, when we are below 18,000 feet, we always want to make sure that we have an accurate and current altimeter setting. And anytime that we are flying along, we need to ensure that every 100 nautical miles at minimum, we have that current altimeter setting. We can get that from flight service stations. We can get that from air traffic controllers, ATIS, any combination of, means. If we intend on taking off on an airport that does not have any reporting equipment, remember that what we want to do is basically ensure that the field elevation is set in our altimeter until we can get a current altimeter setting. So Santos was asking how they log flight engineer time. Same way, you put it, there's a column and you just log the FE time. You have to be appropriately typed as a flight engineer. But once again, it's not really, it's a little bit different because it's a required flight crew member, but you can still log the time. All right, 91,123 is dealing with ATC compliance. There's 4 different parts that we need to look at. But remember that with ATC clearance, anytime that you have ATC instructions, you cannot deviate from that clearance unless it's amended, or there's an emergency that exists, or you are responding to a traffic alert collision avoidance resolution advisory. It's a big fancy thing right there. So this right here is called a TCAS RA. A TCAS is just a traffic collision advisory system. The RA portion is a resolution advisory, and what that does is in the jets and larger aircraft, if there's another aircraft that's basically approaching and from any direction, what it will do is it will give the pilot instructions. Number one, it'll kind of set off an alarm in the cockpit. It'll say that there's a TCAS alert. If they get inside of your protective bubble, the resolution advisory will come into effect, and what will end up happening is on your primary flight display for both pilots, it will tell us either to climb or descend at a given rate, and it will give us kind of a window in terms of how many feet per minute we can climb or descend at. Once the resolution, basically once the TCAS RA is complete and the other aircraft or intruder is not an issue, what you want to do is you want to advise ATC that you're responding to a TCAS RA or an RA, and then it is just I would just ask them again, do you want me to resume my altitude, or is there a different altitude depending on how far up or down? The TCAS RA only really allows for climbs and descents. It doesn't allow you to turn. And it is able to basically manage multiple aircraft intruders at the same time. The second part of the regulation basically states what we talked about in the beginning, that you can operate only in an emergency. You can basically go against any ATC instructions or any of the Part 91 rules only if there's an emergency. Okay. And it's basically just allowing you to deviate. It's another version that's allowing you to deviate from your ATC clearance. We are, anytime that we deviate from a clearance though, it's your obligation to notify ATC of that deviation, what that deviation is, why you deviated, and kind of what you're requesting from them. Keep in mind, it's as soon as possible. Does not mean right this second. Deal with the emergency. Take your time. Don't, if you start rushing during an emergency, you're going to make things a lot worse than better at that point in time. And part number 4, I think we're probably all guilty of this at some point. I know I've done it by accident when I was a pilot, and we're just human beings. No person operating an aircraft may operate that aircraft according to any clearance or instruction that has been issued to another aircraft for radar air control purposes. I've been guilty of it in the past where you accidentally take someone else's, ATC instructions because the call signs are so similar. If there are aircraft under control in the same vicinity, basically by the same controller, they'll advise you that, hey, Cessna 1234, just advising that Piper 1234 is also on frequency, or 12345, something. There'll be a slight difference, and they'll let you know, or they're supposed to let you know. Also keep in mind with ATC clearances, the ATC, even though it's saying we have to follow everything to the T by the letter, you remember they're human beings as well. So if something doesn't make sense, I would always get it confirmed if you're unsure. If it's something maybe screwy, maybe they're giving you an instruction that just doesn't make sense. Maybe they meant to say another call sign. Just get it clarified, and it's better to wait 10 seconds for that clarification rather than taking an instruction that just could potentially put you in harm's way. All right, VFR and IFR fuel requirements. So remember, this goes into our flight planning for the VFR side of things. From our departure to our actual our landing point during the day, for day VFR, we need at least 30 minutes of fuel. And at night, that needs to increase to 45 minutes of fuel. And remember, with VFR flights, we're not required to have an alternate, although it doesn't hurt. For IFR, we go into the 1-2-3 rule, which we're not going to discuss here. But if you're required to have an alternate, you need to have enough fuel. If you're filing IFR, you need to have enough fuel from your departure to your first point of intended landing to your alternate, plus an additional 45 minutes. In the event that an alternate is not required in terms of IFR world, you need to have enough fuel from the departure to your first point of intended landing plus 45 minutes. All right. Going back to your VFR and IFR cruising altitudes. So remember, everything is based on the magnetic track. Once we're above 3,000 feet AGL, we need to be on the corresponding altitudes. The easy way that we usually like to think about it, for us West Coast people, unfortunately, is everybody in the East is odd. All those East Coasters are very, very odd people, okay? So if you are basically eastbound between a heading of 0 and 179 degrees magnetic, you need to be at an odd altitude plus 500 feet. If you are going westbound, which is going to be between 180 and 359 magnetic, you need to be at an even altitude plus 500 feet. Okay, so that's your VFR altitude. Keep in mind that if you have a flight that zigs and zags, and let's say that you initially kind of start heading this way, which would basically be at an even altitude, and then you kind of do this at an odd, and then you go back to even. You want to make sure that you're transitioning either plus 1,000 or below 1,000. However, whatever is going to make the most amount of sense. DPEs tend to fail people, especially even in the theoretical stuff, if they don't compensate for the altitude changes. If you change your VFR, if you change your direction of flight significantly, all right? All right, let's go look at IFR. IFR is the same thing. So remember, IFR altitudes are thousands, odd thousands, and that's going to be if we are basically heading eastbound above 3,000 feet, and if we're heading westbound, it will be even thousands. All right, putting together all of our required documentation and required inspections, just in kind of one easy, slide shot here. First one on the left-hand side is going to be, remember, AERO. So this stands for Airworthiness Certificate. So remember, your Airworthiness Certificate never expires, but it also does not imply that the airplane is actually airworthy. The airworthiness and the registration are two documents that have to be displayed or available for basically the passenger's pilot to look at. In the airline world, there is actually an exemption that allows different air carriers to not comply with this regulation, meaning that they don't have to display it in the public. But for the most part, if you, even in the big airliners out there, if you usually go up towards the first class area right by the lav or the toilet, you'll usually see the airworthiness certificate displayed. The registration is a document that expires every 3 years. So you need to make sure that it's valid. The other thing too is on the back of the registration, there's basically, I think, 5 or 6 different ways that will void out the registration. So you need to be familiar with those. Basically, if you sell the airplane, if you lose your citizenship, if it's registered in a different country, if it becomes destroyed in an accident, those are all some examples of ways that the registration can become invalid or void. The second R is radio operator's license. So obviously, if you intend on flying outside of the country, you're going to need a radio operator's license. And this is for the airplane. This is for the airplane. This isn't the other. This is not for you. The license that you need as an individual is called an FCC radio telephone operator's license, which you just pay the license fee for and you can get it. This one that we're talking about is specific to the aircraft. The O we discussed a little bit earlier, which is operating limitations. This comprises your POH or AFM, instrument markings, and placards. And the W is the weight and balance. The weight and balance that we're talking about here is the official weight and balance calculated by a mechanic. So remember, you need to have all of these documents on board the aircraft prior to departure. The required inspections, we usually use the Aviated acronym or Aviates. So the first A is the annual inspection, and that needs to be done every 12 calendar months. The annual inspection has to be done by an A&P, and they have to have, the big difference is they have to have this thing called an IA, which is inspection authorization. Basically, they have more years, more training, and took another test to get that from the FAA. All right. You need your VOR checked. That has to be done by a pilot only if you're flying IFR and you're intending to use that equipment every 30 days. The 100-hour is required anytime that we're flying for hire or flight instruction. Doesn't matter if it's a private airplane or not. Remember that the 100-hour it's actually the exact same inspection as the annual, except the 100-hour is done by an A&P. The annual is the A&P IA. You can overfly the 100-hour, and you can do so only in the pursuit of maintenance and up to 10 hours in pursuit of maintenance. In the event that you basically eat into that beyond that 100-hour, you basically have to subtract that from your next inspection. So let's say that I kind of went out to the middle of nowhere and I brought the airplane in at 110 hours, brand new engine, to the mechanic. My next 100-hour is going to be due at 200 hours because I've already eaten 10 hours into that 100 in that case. All right. The altimeter pitot-static system check is required every 24 calendar months, only if you're flying on an instrument flight plan in controlled airspace. Most flight schools have this done anyways because they're always training, instrument students, or you never know who's going to use it. Transponder requirements or tests are going to be every 24 calendar months. The ELT is every 12 calendar months, plus the battery test, which we'll talk about here in a second. And the airworthiness directives have to be complied with if necessary. There's 2 different types. There's one time and there's reoccurring. Reoccurring ones, like the most common ones, are going to be on like the Cessnas. So it might say that you need to check the seat rails every single time or something along those lines. All right. The weight and balance, John, is the actual weight and balance that the mechanic computes. So that is, remember, they're basically the basic empty weight of the plane, and they're basically computing the CG. It's not the actual weight and balance for each flight. All right, the FAA test question here. Let me go ahead and reset that and bring this up. So, which list accurately reflects some of the documents required to be current and carried in the U.S. registered civil airplane flying in the United States under day visual flight rules? Is it A, proof of insurance certificate, VFR flight plan, flight itinerary and the aircraft logbook. B, VFR sectional charts for the area in which the flight occurs, aircraft logbook and engine logbook. Or C, airworthiness certificate, approved airplane flight manual, and aircraft registration certificate. 7 more slides, and then we are out of here, everyone. Give everyone another moment on that. Me too, Missy. All right, good job, everyone. So correct answer here is C. It's the airworthiness certificate, the approved airplane flight manual, and aircraft registration certificate. All right, continuing on, we're going to talk about ELTs real quick here. So remember that an ELT is not always required. There are some exceptions out there if you look at the regulations. So this is kind of what we're talking about here. So all aircraft must have on board an ELT, except as listed below. So it has to be attached to the airplane in a manner that minimizes the possibility of damage in the event of a crash. That ELT needs to transmit on 121.5 and 243.0 megahertz. Aircraft and operations, these are just a couple examples that do not need ELTs. So anytime you're fairing an aircraft for ELT installation or repair, training flights within a 50-mile radius from the airport, turbojet powered aircraft, or agriculture operations. There are a couple extra ones out there, which is the 91207 if you want to look at them. And then some do allow for the ELT to be inoperative, but it has to be repaired within a given time frame or X amount of days. In terms of our inspections, remember that the ELT itself, we need to inspect it every 12 calendar months, but we need to replace the battery at 50% or half of its useful life. All right. So every time that we get a battery, and it's usually going to be listed by the mechanic, it will tell us when we need to replace it. It will be calculated at half of its useful life. In addition to that, if we use the device for at least 1 hour of cumulative use, then we also have to replace the battery. So those are our inspection requirements. And remember, that is dealing with the battery. We're not replacing that entire yellow case. There's a battery inside that device. All right, aircraft lighting, 91209. So anytime we are at night, which is going to be from sunset to sunrise, we have to have position lights in use. So those are our red light, green light, and white light on the tail. And then all aircraft have to have some type of anti-collision light on basically at any time the aircraft is in operation. These will vary from aircraft to aircraft, as we know. Some do not have that traditional red light on the tail. There's some aircraft that just have strobe lights on the wingtips. So you need to know which aircraft we're dealing with. Now, the last things that we're going to really be talking about is just the transponder and ADS-B requirements. We'll hold off on the NTSB stuff until Tuesday. But 91-125 are the transponder requirements. Now, on the next slide, we'll talk about the ADS-B requirements, but the ADS-B requirements are honestly 99% the same. There's only one new thing that you need. So let's just stick with the basic transponder requirements first. So these are the areas in which you are required to have a transponder. So the areas are anytime you're in Class A airspace, B airspace, or C airspace, you need to have a transponder. Also, anytime that you're within 30 nautical miles of specific airports listed in Appendix D, which is basically all of our Class Bravo airports. So remember that Mode C veil that surrounds those Class Bravos. That is when you also need a transponder, and that's going to be from the surface up to 10,000 feet MSL. In addition to that, you also need a transponder anytime we are above 10,000 feet MSL, and that excludes any airspace below 2,500 feet above the surface. So that takes care of the basic transponder requirements. So that's kind of our mode. We need that Mode C altitude encoding transponder. As we get into ADS-B, most people incorrectly state that ADS-B is required everywhere, and that's actually not the case. You'll notice that this is the simplified ADS-B charts. Remember, ADS-B is the automatic dependent surveillance broadcast. It is not required everywhere, although most of us probably have it installed at this point. The only difference between the standard transponder and ADS-B is right here that I'll point out. So you need to have the ADS-B anytime we're in class Alpha airspace, anytime we are in class Charlie airspace from the surface up to 10,000 feet, even above the class Charlie. Anytime we're inside of class Bravo airspace, including the mode C Veil up to 10,000 feet. And then class Echo, anytime we're above 10,000 feet MSL, excluding the 2,500 foot rule that we discussed. The new one that they're adding to ADS-B, though, is the Gulf of Mexico. So if you're in the Gulf of Mexico, 12 nautical miles off of the coastline, or from up to 12 nautical miles off the coastline, you're also required to have ADS-B in class Echo if you're between 3,000 to 10,000 feet MSL. That rule does not apply on the Pacific or Atlantic coast, just the Gulf. But you'll notice, other than that one that I circled, it is exactly the same as what we would consider the standard transponder rule. So if you want to take a screenshot of that, I'd recommend it. We'll look at our final two FAA test questions, and then we will wrap it up here for the weekend. So first one I have for you is dealing with our mode C transponder. So in the 48 contiguous states, excluding the airspace at or below 2,500 feet AGL, an operable coded transponder equipped with mode C capability is required in all controlled airspace at and above. Is it A, 12.5, B, 10,000, or C, flight level 180? Thanks, Cody, for putting that up there for everyone. All right, a couple more people here. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap that one up. So we've got 79% of the class with the correct answer. Correct answer here is B. It is 10,000 feet MSL. 12.5 is not really a number unless you're thinking about the oxygen requirements and the transition level of 180. That's class Alpha. But remember, anytime we're above 10,000 feet, that is the legal requirement for that. All right, last question we're going to look at here for tonight is dealing with another transponder question. So let me go ahead and bring this one up. And this is basically dealing with a inoperative transponder. So give me just 1 second while I grab this one. Your transponder is inoperative. I don't think we exactly talked about this, but we'll see. Best guess here, best educated guess, everyone. Your transponder is inoperative. In order to enter Class Bravo airspace, you must submit a request for a deviation from whom? Is it A, the ATC facility, no less than 24 hours before the proposed operation? Is it B, the nearest FSDO 24 hours before the proposed operation? Or is it C, the ATC facility, anytime prior to entering controlled airspace? All right, got a couple more people answering. All right, so we have most of the class with the best guess answer here, which is going to be C. which is controlling ATC facility at any time prior to entering controlled airspace. Obviously, you want to do it prior to entering their airspace, but you also want to make sure that it's whoever runs or controls that actual area to let them know. In the event you need to look up an air traffic control number, you can find a majority of them for your local area inside of your chart supplement. Okay. All right, everyone. So we're going to call it right here. We'll save the last 7 slides for the NTSB stuff for Tuesday. But we'll stick around for a little bit, see if anybody has any specific questions that we can answer. Appreciate you all hanging out with us. Hope everyone has a good weekend otherwise, and I'll potentially see some people here on the private pilot class. If not, I will see you on Tuesday during the our class, our commercial class. Let's see here. All right. But thank you, everyone. Appreciate you sticking with us. There's only 7, actually more, 10 more slides. Cody's got the Discord link as well that you can join. I think there's a bunch of people there. There's also the Facebook group. So you're in there. All right, so Sergey is asking about special VFR. So special VFR is a application that we can use if you, let's say you're not an instrument rated pilot. No instrument rated pilot files special VFR, but remember, VFR conditions is 3 statute miles of visibility and a 1,000-foot ceiling. If it's less than that, you can request a special VFR clearance. Private pilots can do it only a day clearance. If you have an instrument rating, you can do it for night as well. But that allows you to kind of get around the situation below basic VFR. And in addition to that, you just have to, you have to remain clear of clouds at that point. So it allows a little bit more flexibility in and out of the airport. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a good one. Tracy, David, Douglas, have a great one. Mark, Ray, Johnny, have a great one. Thanks again, Cody, for everything. Samuel, yep, review the video. Have a good one. Nope, Joel, there's no ADSB out inspection requirements like the transponder. They're basically one and the same. They kind of take its place. Hamza, have a good one. William's got the Discord link if anyone needs it. How to use and apply MSL versus AGL. So remember, MSL is mean sea level. That's pretty much most of the altitudes we're going to be looking at or flying. So when we talk about flying at 6,500 feet, as long as we have a correct barometric pressure setting in there, a baro setting, then that's going to be your MSL. AGL is the distance above the ground level. So if we are flying along in our little tiny airplane here, it's the distance from the actual aircraft to however far the ground is. So the AGL is always changing based on terrain and everything that we're flying over. Good night, Samuel. Good night, Theron. Steven's asking, can you fly a private aircraft owner for compensation on a regular basis? You can, as long as they own the airplane. If they're renting the airplane, you can't do it. If they own it via a lease, let's say something along those lines, then you can absolutely do it. And you have to obviously be qualified to fly it. Daniel is commenting 10,000 foot requirement only applies if you have an aircraft with an electrical system. I'm sure that's the case. All of the regulations that we're talking about, there's always like a caveat. So like with aircraft lighting, if you don't have an electrical system, it actually doesn't apply. If you install an electrical system after a given point in time, then you actually have to apply, or then it actually applies to you. Let's see here. Johnny, that is the correct email address. Thanks again, Spencer. Thanks, George. So Santosh, why marginal VFR or MVFR if marginal VMC when you were either VFR, SVFI? You're gonna have to clarify. You're using a lot of terms there, Santosh, but the special VFR clearances are really the only people who are going to use it are private pilots. Honestly, if you have an instrument rating, you're probably just going to file IFR. It's smarter and it's safer to do so. I'm having trouble dissecting all of those different things. I don't know what MVMC, marginal VMC. You're either VMC or you're IMC. It's one or the other. Tiffany, yep, I did. So it is here right now. Sun and Fun, yep, we'll probably be at Sun and Fun and Oshkosh, hopefully if they don't cancel them this year. So hopefully we'll meet some of you guys and gals out there. Thanks again, Carl, Kelly, have a great one. Mark, have a great one. Thank you again to all the mods again. So Missy, Zaf, Tom, have a great one. Rebecca as well. Eric is asking, does the hours for an instrument rating count towards the 10 hours in 61-129? No, you cannot double count them. But if you accumulate additional hours during your instrument training, a lot of people, most people are not going to do the minimum of 15 hours of dual during your instrument. Most are like in the 20 to 30 hour range. Anything above 15 hours, that's the requirement. What you want to do is you want to have your instructor basically put that it is these hours are specifically in the comments for 61-129. So that way you get the credit for it before you get to your commercial flight. Let's see here. Thanks again, Eric. Have a good one. RJ, have a great one. Afra, for the private pilot written endorsement, just want to confirm, did you send your Google form so that way we can actually get it to you? The mini quizzes and stuff, Afra, don't actually apply. You only need to take the final private pilot written in order to get it. If you scored 95, you should get it, but I just want to make sure you actually sent in the Google Doc. Fritz, the flight from Byron was slow. I think I averaged 67 knots the other day, and the smoke definitely cleared out in California, but kind of being in a foreign plane, especially at night, I think we left around 5:30 or 6 or something like that, and then night kind of slowly crept in. It was definitely really painful and slow. I mean, I guess they call Cessna 152s time builders for a reason, right? So Leon, so common carriage, as we discussed, really we only talked about common carriage because anything outside of common carriage would be considered private carriage. But the common carriage rules, looking back at it, are going to be, let me grab my book real quick here. You need to meet 4 criteria. One is for compensation or higher. I will give you the exact definition here. Let me find it. 119.1. I'll look at that too. All right, so common carriage is, you have to have these four criteria. So it's holding out of a willingness. So basically a form of advertising. You have to, and it's a form of advertising to transport people or property from place to place for compensation or hire. So if you were to break that sentence apart, it is holding out. So advertising, transporting from place to place, which is part 2. Part 2 is transporting people or property. Part 3 is from place to place. And part 4 of that statement is for compensation or hire. So if it meets all 4 of those, then we call that common carriage. Private is just anything outside of that statement. Thanks again, Cody. I really appreciate it. If you actually want to send me an email, just so I can follow up with you, Cody, feel free to do so. David@checkride-prep.com. Yeah, thank you, Missy. Marginal VFR is not a legal thing. You're either VFR or you're IFR. It's one or the other. You're flying under one set of flight rules. So you're either flying under visual flight rules or you're flying under instrument flight rules. That's really what it is. Yeah, all right. So Santosh, yeah, MV and MC apparently don't exist. Yeah, that's probably the reason why I was a little bit unfamiliar with them. It's either the terminology that we use as pilots is instrument flight rules, which is IFR, visual flight rules, which is VFR. So those are the different rules that we fly under with Part 91. Then we talk about weather itself. So weather itself is described as VMC, which is visual meteorological conditions, or IMC, which is instrument meteorological conditions. So you could be flying, let's say, under instrument flight rules, but under VMC conditions. It could be a perfectly clear day. Or you could be flying in the clouds, which would be considered IMC. Is it best to use follow on? What do you mean by follow on, Patrick? And yep, Fritz, the special VFR clearance is just like any other clearance. So they're gonna hold traffic in and out of that airport, especially IFR traffic, until your report clears. So marginal VFR is just it allows flexibility for pilots to get in and out of airports if it's less than basic VFR. It's just it's kind of allowing a pilot to kind of circumvent the rules for specific cases. Yes, I mean if they don't cancel next year, Rich, but hopefully we're looking at attending both Oshkosh and Sun and Fun. So Sun and Fun in April, and then Oshkosh later in the summer there. So hopefully we'll be able to do that. AFRA, the Google form, if you go to the private pilot lesson, it's going to be under lesson 12. Or if you go to the private pilot final exam, in there, it will say, what do you want to do? And one of the things it clearly states is, I want to request a written endorsement, or I want to request wings credits. If you can't find it, send me an email, AFRA, and I'll get it to you, and then we can submit it. But without that, we don't actually submit or send out the certificates. Let's see, you're never flying under marginal VFR. You are only flying under. Okay, so Santosh, you're either flying under VFR or IFR. Those are the only two flight rules that we have. So Rebecca's got that. Thank you. Fritz, routing coming back was I think it was basically going down towards like Harris Ranch area. So like Crow's Nest or whatever that abandoned airport is, Crow's Landing, and then continuing down towards Harris Ranch, cutting across the Paso Robles, and then going from Paso to Santa Maria, San Marcos VOR, like out by Santa Barbara, and then down. Although I'll admit, for all the waypoints that I put in there, I slowly started deleting them just because the aircraft was taking forever. So, wow, a 152 from Atlanta to Seattle. Yeah, it says the 152 says that it is capable of like 105 knots. I don't know if I ever saw that. I mean, there was no wind. It wasn't in my favor, and it wasn't. I didn't have a tailwind. I really didn't have a headwind, but I mean, it was just slow. So, Raquel, can you fly through TFRs on an IFR flight? Yes. If you ever read a temporary flight rule or restriction, that is. At the very, very bottom of the TFR, it gives a really long laundry list of who can fly through a TFR. It's usually participating aircraft, but one of the other things too is if you're on an IFR flight plan and you're going specifically to a certain destination, then you can actually fly through a TFR. The nice thing about IFR is if they don't want you there, they'll tell you, so they'll let you know. Tiffany is confused. I asked if my instrument instructional hours would count towards my commercial. The answer was yes, not where in my over 100 hours restriction. Okay, so Tiffany, if you have a minimum requirement of 15 hours with an instructor for your instrument license, Anything that you do above and beyond the 15 hours, what we do here and what most instructors do, you have to ask them or remind them to do it, is all of the hours beyond that, at least 10 hours of those beyond that. So basically from hours 16 through 25, in the notes section, have them write in that this is meeting the requirement for 61-129. And then that way you can check the box or meet the requirements before you're even done with the instrument training. Hopefully that answers the question. I do not know, Santosh, the marginal VFR. Those are the conditions that we talk about. So let's see here. Sean is asking, what's a good scenario for an IFR contact approach? Most of us probably don't actually use a contact approach, but the best conditions that I could think of would be like let's say it's a really sunny day and the sun's really just not working in your favor. And let's say you're flying into the sunset and you know where the airport is. It's kind of it's considered VFR conditions. If the sun was not directly in front of you, I bet you could probably find the airport. But let's say that it's a little bit hazy and it's just hard to find, but you kind of if you get closer, then you'll be able to see it immediately. So that would kind of be a good circumstance to ask for a contact approach. At the end of the day, remember with the contact approach, you're kind of forfeiting your right to execute a missed approach. So you can always just ask for a full instrument approach, which is probably safer because you could basically get established on the approach and it might take a little while. You might cross the final approach fix and then see the airport. And once you see the airport, then you can basically call it and say that airport in sight, and then they'll probably re-clear you for the visual. But the contact approach, that's probably when I would do it. All right, let's see here. Thanks, Cody. Appreciate it. Yeah, Rex, I remember that as well, that decompression accident with the Learjet. I think, you're right. It was on autopilot. That was a while ago, though. I think they did a YouTube video on that as well. So, yep, gliders don't have to worry about a lot of that stuff anyways. Yeah, I bet you drive boats faster than what I was flying. I think at some point cars must have been passing me on the freeway. So Tiffany, if you already have your IFR ticket, if you know the instructor, just have them go in and add in 61-129 and then that's it. So that you just need them to mark it as 61-129. So that way you have a requirement in your commercial that you need 10 hours of instrument training. And if you already have the dual previously, just have your instructor just mark those hours as 61-129. We go back and do it all the time. Yeah, Payne Stewart, that's it, the golfer. So Fritz, if you do the Cirrus VFR transition course, that is considered a TAA. So as long as you have the 10 hours, then that would check the boxes. And yeah, you just want to make sure that they sign off and say that it's TAA time. If just make sure that they put TAA in there, just so that because some of the older Cirruses are not really considered a TAA. If you go back to the old ones. Sean, do you think we should not glare on AFD airports that have glares during sunset? It's a big safety thing, maybe. Yeah, I mean, that would be kind of cool if we had something like that in the chart supplement or facility directory. especially on sunset. I mean, Camarillo and Oxnard perfectly aligned with that sun. So, and Fritz, yep, if it's a dual, if it's G1000, then it'll be considered. I think one of the requirements is that it has to have a PFD and an MFD, and it also has to have an autopilot that's tied to it. So a Cirrus, for the most part, all the aircraft that I can think of, that meets the bill. And Missy, the marginal VFR, I could have sworn that's kind of like the weather term. So remember, they've got like low IFR, IFR, marginal VFR, and then VFR. But if you look at a marginal VFR, it's 1 to 3, 3 to 5. But you request the marginal or the special VFR if it's less than basic VFR, which is 1,000 foot ceiling and 3 statute miles. So, does anyone else have any more questions? We've got about 3 more minutes, and then the system will kick us off here. So, thanks again, Tiffany. I appreciate it. 61129 is wow. 140 Walla Walla to Auburn. That must have been a long trip, I can imagine. And of course, yeah, 150s do not have autopilots. So. Interesting, Missy. I know, Missy, the NOAA does put out that list of that low IFR, marginal VFR, and it has basically the same thing of the definitions, even though it's not really a flight rule. It's just kind of like just generalization, I guess, or what at least I always described it as what the weather folks use. Have a good one, Tom. No clue why it's called FRMC. You're using a lot of stuff. Have a great one, Steven. All right, everyone, got about like 2 minutes. If you got any more last minute questions, let me know. If not, shoot me an email. We'll be happy to look at them over the weekend here. You can double dip in certain things as long as the requirements are different, but you need to be very, very clear on what you're doing. So, can a CFI double mark 6165 and 61129? No, you can't. All right, so if you have a single hour of instrument time, you can't say that this single hour is for both 6165 and 61129. When you meet all the requirements for 6165, everything above and beyond, all the way up here, this stuff all up here can be labeled for 61129. That's what we mean by making sure that it's labeled correctly. You can't double dip in the way that I think it is. Sean, flight category, yeah. Just like what we see all the time with the little color codings, little greens, pinks, all that stuff. Flight rule, meteorological conditions. Okay, gotcha, Santosh. Good luck, Missy. All right, got about 60 seconds, and the system will automatically kick us off. So any more questions for the weekend, feel free to shoot me an email. If not, we can talk about it on Tuesday, or I might see some of you in the private pilot class on Monday. But I hope everyone has a great weekend. We will talk to you later, and take care. Stay safe out there, everyone. Bye-bye.